also started doing interviews with PhD scientists, and they seemed to be so afraid. Like, they would say things like, I can't talk about that study, or if we're gonna talk about fat, I have nothing to say. They would hang up the phone on me.
Wow.
I would get off the phone and I would be trembling like I had been investigating the mob. What is going on in this field of science?
There's no human biological requirement for grains. This is something that we're sort of somehow led to believe, through television marketing and those pretty little heart logos on the boxes of cereals, that somehow we need to eat oatmeal in the morning.
Who knows what's going to happen? It might be autoimmune disease or another degenerative neurologic disorder like multiple sclerosis. It could be Parkinson's. It's really an all-you-can-eat buffet of chronic disease. You don't know what you're going to come away with when you go up to that table, but it's not going to be good.
This is incredible. Let's get cooking.
I think what's really important is that this can be done anywhere, particularly at home. I mean, it's really one pan, 6 ingredients, eggs, some sort of vegetable, and a meat, preferably bacon, and fattier the better.
Hi, I'm Montel Williams.
And I'm Naomi Whittle.
And I gotta thank you all for having watched the entire series of The Real Skinny on Fat, the truth about weight loss. So it was so exciting to take a look back at some of the footage that normally in, let's say, a motion picture or a television show winds up on a cutting room floor. Not because we wanted to, but you just don't have space. We have a little luxury here that we can offer this in a bonus episode, so people are gonna see all those bonus interviews that you didn't get in the first 9 episodes. And I think this is great. That's because of how good your interviews were, lady.
No, Montel, what I got so excited about is that each and every one of the interviews that we have in the bonus are interviews that you cannot miss. They're interviews that can transform your life and your health just as much as every one of our episodes. So I'm thrilled that we had the privilege to be able to put these together into a bonus.
You know what? Make sure you enjoy watching.
Nina Teicholz, thank you very much for being here. We have been waiting to do this interview because the work that you've done over the past decade and beyond is so important to our world, especially to our country and the health of our future, the health of all of us and our children and grandchildren beyond. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here.
Can you tell me just a little bit about your background and what got you into the work that you do today?
Yes, well, I'm a journalist, and I had studied biology a little bit at Stanford and Yale, but I really had not done anything in this field until I started to write a series of investigative food stories for Gourmet magazine, and they assigned me a story on trans fats.
When was this?
This is in the early 2000s. So what were trans fats? I had no idea. I had no interest in nutrition. But this opened up a whole world for me. First of all, I mean, dietary fat is what everybody obsesses about most in eating, myself included. I mean, I was a low-fat vegetarian for 25 plus years, like not eating any butter, no meat, thinking I was, and I was pretty actually overweight at the time. But Americans obsess about fat, non-fat, low-fat, good fat, bad fat. I mean, how confusing is the subject of fat? And now we're these fats I had never heard of, trans fats. And in researching this subject, it opened up this whole mysterious world. I mean, all of a sudden I found that the story seemed to be, first of all, kind of upside down and backwards from what we had always thought. That the low-fat diet is good, that saturated fats, the kind of fats in animal foods, are bad for us. And I also started doing interviews with PhD scientists, and And they were so closed to talking about this subject, and they seemed to be so afraid. Like they would say things like, I can't talk about that study, or I can't, if we're going to talk about fat, I have nothing to say. Or they would hang up the phone on me.
Wow.
And so sometimes I would get off the phone and I would be trembling like I had been investigating the mob. Like, what is going on in this field of science? Or stories about people getting their papers yanked from journals because somebody from the margarine industry had visited a newspaper editor. Or I just discovered that this world, it seemed like there was sort of a cover-up story here. So this is what entered me into this fascinating world, and I ended up spending really almost a decade of my life to investigate and research for my book. I mean, like thousands and thousands and thousands of scientific studies trying to get to the bottom of this question. Like, is fat and cholesterol, are they bad for health? Should I not eat meat? What is the story there?
This article that you wrote for Gourmet Magazine on trans fats really opened up your curiosity into your own health, it sounds like. And from there, you spent a decade writing a book on the topic.
Right, so that book is The Big Fat Surprise, and that was the culmination of all this work. It's a work really it tells the story of the science, kind of science gone wrong, the personalities, the politics, the players. It's kind of a thriller. Like, my favorite description of my book is by The Economist, which said, this is a nutrition thriller. It's a page turner that you can't put down, because it is an incredible story about how science got off track and how there seemed to be no return. And it's really a book more ultimately about politics than science, because politics is what explains how we are in this position that we are today, which is a hypothesis about fat and heart disease and obesity that could never be proven, despite billions of dollars by our government trying to prove this hypothesis true, and they never could. So why do we still have it? That's the political story.
So let's start at the beginning of this misinformation, miscommunication that occurred, and take us through the journey.
So it was also true that when I was starting out my research, I had this little tiny restaurant review column, like in a little free throwaway newspaper, neighborhood newspaper. And they would send me to restaurants, and we didn't have any budget to pay for meals, so we would just had to accept whatever the restaurant decided was their favorite food that they wanted to showcase, and I had to accept it. So, and remember, I'm a vegetarian, so normally I would go into a restaurant and order stir-fried vegetables or some vegetarian entree, and instead I discovered that's not what chefs wanted to showcase in many of these restaurants. They wanted to send out their red meat and their foie gras and all these sort of forbidden foods that I hadn't eaten for decades. And I thought I found them sort of, when I got over my fear, I thought they were earthy and rich and textured and really interesting flavors. And then I discovered, a couple months into this, that I was really losing weight, like quite a lot of weight, which I had always been had a tough time, like many women, with my weight. And so not only was I effortlessly dropping weight, but I went to my doctor and he did my whole cholesterol panel and he said, you look better than ever. So that was another part of this mystery. Like, here I was doing everything wrong, but I looked healthier than I had in decades. So,
and your doctor proved it out too through your blood work.
Yeah, so all my cholesterol levels look better,
Wow.
I mean, whereas before when I was young, I had gone to spas to try to lose weight. And I still have the medical sheet from one of those saying, you're overweight and your cholesterol doesn't look good. Saturated fat is bad. Make sure you lower your saturated fat. So since the early 2000s, there's been a huge volume of studies now looking at this idea. Maybe it's not fat. Maybe it's carbohydrates. What is the effect of carbohydrates? So that has led to a large and fast-growing volume of literature now that really makes the case that it's really carbohydrates are what we need to reduce in order to be healthy.
And so why is it in today's climate, when you say the three-letter word, fat,
Right.
most of the time you're going to get a negative response? And low fat, no fat, diet products, they're everywhere. Why do you think we are living in this paradigm? And has the shift begun, or where are we going from your experience?
Well, first of all, you have to understand that we have been living with misinformation for over half a century. So we are completely convinced that fat is bad for health. Saturated fat is the worst kind of fat. And so it's very hard to reverse out of that thinking. An amazing thing you may not know is that there is actually no more low-fat diet advice. If you go look for the word low fat on the website of the American Heart Association or the U.S. government, which publishes the dietary guidelines, which is where those are the two most important bodies issuing dietary advice, the word low fat, not there anymore.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Nobody knows that. So that's because
When did it go away?
So they've sort of been tiptoeing away from it slowly. There has actually not been any low-fat dietary advice since 2000, the year
Wow.
2000. So isn't that incredible? So they're kind of like just slow reverse, quietly reversing out of the low-fat diet. But the public hasn't been told. There's never been an announcement, a public relations release saying, hey, we are completely reversing all of our advice from the last 35 years. And for reasons, I don't know, maybe it's liability, maybe they fear being sued for having given the wrong advice to people for so many decades. I really don't know the reason why. So we no longer have a low-fat diet. We also no longer have any caps on cholesterol. That was another, that was center staged, a pillar of advice. Avoid cholesterol, don't eat egg yolks, don't have shellfish, don't eat liver. All of that is because it has high cholesterol content. But the American Heart Association backed out of their advice in 2013, and 2015 the government also dropped it. So those are two pillars of dietary advice for the last 50 years gone. But saturated fats is like the remaining, pillar of dietary advice that they have not backed out of. And the reason that we haven't backed out of this advice publicly, or the saturated fat caps still exist, is a complicated set of explanations. I mean, one of them is certainly the food industry. That's sort of the bogeyman that we all know and read about in the media. The food industry has definitely invested in huge amounts of money in trying to influence scientists, influence science. One industry that I detail a great deal in my book is the vegetable oil industry. Because if you're not eating saturated fats, you're eating unsaturated, polyunsaturated vegetable oils. And so who are the vegetable oil companies? Some of the biggest companies in the world, ADM, Monsanto, Cargill, Bunge. These are huge multinational companies. Some of them were really in there from the start. One story I found in my book was that Procter & Gamble, maker of Crisco oil, they actually trained their eyes on the American Heart Association back in 1948. So at the time, the American Heart Association was like this little sleepy kind of cardiologist association. Remember, cardiology was a new a new profession because heart disease was so rare. So they had no money, they had no budget, and Procter & Gamble decided to designate the American Heart Association as the beneficiary of this very popular radio show. And such that they overnight, according to their own official histories, they say overnight millions of dollars flowed into our coffers, and we were handed over checks by Procter & Gamble themselves at this exciting banquet. And they said, if that was what enabled us to become the powerhouse that we are today.
Remarkable.
The biggest nonprofit in the country. So, and not too long afterwards, the American Heart Association is saying, eat vegetable oils rather than saturated fats. And actually, the president of the American Heart Association was criticized by one of his colleagues. He said, isn't that just rank commercialism that you held up a bottle of Crisco oil in that movie that you did, Mr. President? Because they had been paid, I guess, to promote those oils. What has kept these policies in place? So the food industry has clearly played a role. There are so many companies that benefit from our current dietary advice, soy, grain, corn. Those are all huge beneficiaries. And they know how to manipulate the science really at the root. They're not so stupid as to wait until the science comes out and policy is being made. They know that if they get in there in the early starts, get people at conferences, fund the science to have it come out the way they want, that's the way to really influence what science is out there.
And even at the university level, when the students are learning, they're funding their lunches, they're funding their events that they go to. I mean, I have a number of good friends that are just going through college right now in these different industries, and Monsanto and so many others are funding a good portion of their experiences throughout university.
They fund media retreats. They fund, you look at the list of funders for the American Heart Association, the American Diabetes Association, the American Dietetics Association. They're all, major food companies, ingredient manufacturers, and pharmaceutical companies. When I first started doing this research, I thought, why is Big Pharma funding nutritionists? They have nothing to do with nutrition. That's about food. But first of all, they have a clear interest in keeping people unwell. If it turns out that you can cure yourself by eating a healthy diet, you no longer need all those medications. And that, unfortunately, is a huge conflict of interest for Big Pharma.
Right.
And they also benefit from nutrition experts promoting the whole LDL hypothesis, that you need to lower your LDL cholesterol by reducing saturated fats, because Big Pharma, the only thing they know how to do, they have medication for, is LDL lowering medication. They tried to make medication that would raise your HDL, your good cholesterol. They couldn't do it. So they're not interested in that heart disease risk factor, even though that one turns out to be a better predictor of heart attacks. They can't lower your triglycerides, which are driven by carbohydrate intake. That's another. So they don't have a pill for that. So they're really interested in promoting a theory for which the theory that fat and saturated fat are bad for health, because that's what they have pills for. So there's industry interests behind all of this, clearly. But I think there are other explanations that are less obvious. One of them is that early on, the scientists truly believed this hypothesis. They sort of fell in love with this hypothesis. They could not accept any evidence to the contrary. They just couldn't see it. Even in their own papers, some of the most amazing experiences I had was reading their own papers where their data says one thing. Their data says no effect of saturated fat. And their little summary at the top says the opposite. They couldn't even believe their own data. So these early scientists just could never challenge their own beliefs. I think the next generation of scientists, many of them are also believers, but now we have a situation where 3 generations of scientists at top universities have invested themselves in this idea of the diet-heart hypothesis, and it's just nearly impossible to reverse out. It's just the level of cognitive dissonance to think my career has been wrong, our institution has been wrong, I think it's just sort of an insurmountable obstacle for many of these professionals at all these top universities. And I think the other factor is that this idea became institutionalized. So then you have, National Institute of Health, American Heart Association, every other association has adopted this advice. Well, institutional science is a little bit of an oxymoron. What is science? Science needs to be self-doubting, self-questioning. When you see new observations, you have to shift your idea maybe. Maybe you weren't right. Institutions are the opposite. They have to be steady.
Right.
They want their publics to trust them. They can't be flip-flopping on their public. They cannot shift their course very easily. So here we have a situation where a weak hypothesis based on very insubstantial evidence became institutionalized, and then it just became rigid. And it's just seemingly impossible to abandon it.
And so while it's becoming rigid, our overweight and obesity situation is becoming an epidemic.
Which amazingly, they continue to, instead of reflecting upon themselves and saying, maybe we got it wrong, maybe our advice isn't perfect. Obesity and type 2 diabetes continue to rocket on upwards, and we've just been giving the same advice for the past 35 years. I mean, the definition of insanity is to repeat the same advice over and over and expect different outcomes, right? But instead, they blame the American public. They tell everybody out there, you're not working hard enough, your diet is not good enough, you don't exercise enough, you're fat and you're lazy and you fail to adhere. And that's basically what they tell the American people, that it's their fault.
And so as an American person, most of us come, this country is built on immigrants. Talk to us a little bit about how, as an American, we would accept this hypothesis, really, right?
Right.
Where is the proof? Why would we be the types of people that would accept this kind of information?
Why would we be so, like, receptive to?
Yes.
Well, it's interesting. I've thought about this quite a lot because I've done interviews and talked to people in other countries, and they will say, this low-fat thing, I never really believed it. And
Right.
even in the U.S., people in the middle of the country, more in the Midwest and the South, and they say, I grew up on a ranch or a farm, and we always had whole milk, and none of us were fat, and my grandfather ate bacon for breakfast every day. They sort of remember, they have their own heritage they haven't given up. But in the 50s, really, and 60s, when Ansel Keys and his ideas were coming in, most American women who did the cooking, they're immigrants, right? Or they come from immigrant families. So they don't really have their grandmother's recipes right there. Or they're not celebrating their family holidays maybe with their grandparents because they're immigrants. And at that time, families, if you came to America, you tried to assimilate. So you just want to do whatever is new and right? Yes, of course you're going to choose Crisco over the lard of your grandmother. And actually that was the way Crisco was marketed. Forgo lard, it's like the spinning wheel of your grandmother. Oh. Here, have something new and clean that comes out of a chemistry lab from clean, shiny surfaces named Crisco, which is hardened vegetable oils, which never existed until the early 1900s. So I think as an immigrant nation, we were just more susceptible to these ideas that came from scientists. They put the man on the moon. We did all kinds of amazing advances with science. Maybe science could solve the questions in our kitchen too. And we didn't have our grandmothers there our grandmothers' recipe books to rely upon. Whereas in other nations, I think they really are closer to their own traditions. But I want to say, I think it's a tragedy for many cultures around the world to adopt what turned out to be our bad advice because, food is a way of transmitting culture. It's part of each and every person's unique individual culture. We should not all be Mediterranean. If you're Swiss, you should eat, you should have the right to be part of your culture through your food and know that that's healthy and good.
I think you make a really good point. I was born in Switzerland, and as a little girl, I thought I came from Swiss cheese. So I was so connected culturally to the cheeses, to the good fats that stayed with me. And I remember also coming to this country and just being really confused about this whole idea of not being able to eat the foods that I had grown up with and loved and been nourished with. So I can only imagine for the mothers that were not able to rely on their grandmothers' ways of doing things, having their grandmothers' cookbooks, having those recipes that are passed down through the families that have nourished us for such periods of time, to not have that and instead go into this experiment, really.
It really has been an experiment on the entire American population without our consent. Mm-hmm. It's been an experiment on the whole American population that we were put on this low-fat diet, and it ruined our health.
And we can see it in the numbers today.
And I think that it is an amazing thing when you think about how somebody could imagine that a diet completely different from every generation before them could be the healthy diet that would protect them from heart disease, help them lose weight. I know a French woman coming from, she said, I don't eat cheese because I don't want my children to be orphans. But she knows that her mother and her grandmother and her great-grandparents, they all ate cheese.
Of course.
And they didn't die. So it is this kind of strange loss of knowledge of our history. When I was young, people always used to say to me in school, you must read history in order for it not to repeat itself, and you must be educated in history. And history was always my least favorite subject. But then when I started understanding this topic, I realized this is a case where we've just completely forgotten our history. Our own personal history, the history of our families, the history of what we used to eat. All of that we've just somehow completely forgotten.
So we fell into this hypothesis that has become the mantra of the way we live today, despite all the challenges that come with it. What do you think keeps us in this mindset? And can you tell us a little bit about the guidelines that we follow?
Yes. I mean, the reason that we continue to think that high grain, low fat diet is good for health is that that is still what we are told by all of our reigning experts. You know, Harvard, Tufts, American Heart Association, and most importantly, the USDA dietary guidelines. So I'm sure everybody thinks, oh, the dietary guidelines, what are those? Who cares? I don't go to a .gov website to look up my dietary advice, but I think that they're the most powerful lever on the food supply and what people think is a healthy diet in the world, really.
Wow. Why do you say in the world?
Because the dietary guidelines, which began in 1980 in the U.S., they were really the first national guidelines telling people how to eat. And they came to be seen as the gold standard. And they were exported all over the world. So most countries nowadays follow the guidelines from the United States, and they consider them to be the absolute best science. But the U.S. guidelines, they basically just took what the American Heart Association had done and made a carbon copy of it. And they just downloaded what the American Heart Association was saying. And that has remained true. The American Heart Association and the USDA dietary guidelines are virtually identical.
And why would that be? Why is that?
Because the same experts who had been in charge of the American Heart Association guidelines really were the same people who then became part of the expert committees of the U.S. dietary guidelines.
I see.
So there's this small group of nutrition experts that really dominate nutrition policy. Originally it was Ansel Keys and his buddy Jerry Stamler, and there was a small group of, at that point they were all men. Now there are some women in this club as well, but I call them the nutrition aristocrats because they are just so dominant. They run the expert committees at the American Heart Association and at the Dietary Guideline Committee. They're in charge. They're the ones who review the papers for the major medical journals. They sit on the editorial boards. I mean, they're really in control of nutrition policy and expert opinion. If you are not in with them, you will find it very hard to get your paper published or be invited to an expert conference. Oh. So they're really the people who control the nutrition agenda and what we think.
And how does the science sort of work with these guidelines? How does it actually translate, and how are the decisions made as to how many grains we should be eating? I'm sure there's some real science there.
Well, they assign, every 5 years, they renew the guidelines. They assign an expert committee of 13 to 15 people, and those people are supposed to look over the best and most current science from the last 5 years and then produce an expert report. Well, when I looked at the 2015 expert report, I thought, well, I've just been reading science nonstop for 10 years. None of the science that I read was in this report. None of the science from the last 5 years was there. From 2010 to 2015 was one of the greatest reconsiderations of saturated fats. More than a dozen reviews came out, really questioning and concluding, we got it wrong on saturated fats. The guidelines are not evidence-based. So I went looking for those studies in this expert report. Well, they might be there, but they misstated the conclusion, or they didn't include some of them. And the same was true on other studies. They never included. It turns out that no successive dietary guideline committee has ever looked at the vast majority of government-funded clinical trials on nutrition, which is to say the government has spent billions of dollars to try to figure out if fat and saturated fat are bad for health. And none of those studies have ever been reviewed by any successive dietary guideline committee.
How is it possible?
Well, it seems impossible, doesn't it?
Right, yes.
So I did a cover story for the British Medical Journal, the BMJ, with these facts. And the entire nutrition establishment came down upon my head for that. I basically said, you never looked at all the major nutrition trials, and there's almost no rigorous science in these guidelines, which is to say, you recommend these dietary patterns, but they're supported by a minuscule amount of clinical trial information, which is the rigorous kind of science that you need to show
Right.
cause and effect. So 180 nutrition scientists sign a letter from around the world, signed a letter saying, you must retract this paper, to the BMJ. You must take back this paper. We did somebody I know did some FOIA, Freedom of Information Act requests. It turns out this retraction letter went around the world. Dear colleague, please ask to retract this paper. Nobody asked a question, not a single question. What's wrong with the paper? Where are her mistakes? It was just like, silence this, get it out of the literature. It was such an offense to people. And I guess I knew it was an aggressive thing to do, but it felt like it had to be done. Somebody had to
Absolutely.
show that this is the truth. So the BMJ put the whole matter to outside reviewers, and after a year, they concluded the facts are good, this paper stands, there's no reason for retraction. There were a few minor corrections that had absolutely no effect on any of the assertions in the paper. But, I mean, this effort to silence me is something that has gone on throughout nutrition science. This is one of the reasons that we don't have these studies. How is it possible that we haven't heard the results from all this government-funded research? And that is because the results of those studies, when they came out, they basically did not support Ansel Keys' hypothesis. They didn't support the idea that saturated fat was bad for health, that the low-fat diet could prevent any kind of disease. And so their results were effectively just ignored. I mean, there are really incredible stories about the results from the Framingham study showed that the more saturated fat you ate, the less likely you were to die of a heart attack. Those results in an NIH basement, never published. The results from the largest ever nutrition trial ever undertaken, called the Women's Health Initiative, on 49,000 women, all following the low-fat diet for 7 to 8 years. The results from that study, just completely stuffed. Nobody talks about them. Never reviewed. Not included in any dietary guideline committee report. Just not there. Or if they have them, there's some like secondary analysis that doesn't really state the conclusions. You know, it is like a cover-up story. It's like the science doesn't go the way you want it, so just cover it up or don't talk about it. And really the most amazing example that I discovered was something called the Minnesota Coronary Survey, the biggest ever test of Ansel Keys' hypothesis. And it was on some 9,000 men and women in 5 Minnesota mental hospitals. The kind of experiment that you couldn't do today because it would be considered unethical to put people in a diet when they're institutionalized. But it's a really good experiment because you control everybody's food, right? When you're in it's called a highly controlled study. You really control everything they're eating. Mm-hmm. So half the people had what was considered a regular amount of saturated fat and cholesterol. So 18% of their calories were from saturated fat. That's like twice or 3 times the limit of what we're told to eat today. But meat, butter, cheese, everything normal. The other people in the experimental group, they had 9% saturated fat. Which is still more than we're told to eat today. But they had soy-filled cheese, soy-filled milk, and, vegetable patties instead of meat. At the end of that experiment, they could not show any benefit, any cardiovascular benefit. You were not spared a heart attack if you had cut your saturated fat intake by half. In other words, the diet heart hypothesis could not be shown to be true. That study was not published for 16 years. And when they finally did publish it, they put it in this little out-of-the-way journal that they knew no nutrition scientist would read. And when the principal investigator, Ivan France, was asked much later by a journalist, well, why did you not publish? And he said, well, there was nothing wrong with the study. We were just so disappointed in the way it came out. It's incredible. And then later, in 2015, some NIH researchers discovered that actually Ivan France hadn't even published the full results. He found some other results in Ivan France's basement, which, on tapes, on old magnetic tapes, and they went back and examined them all. They found that the men who were most effective, most successful at lowering their cholesterol had the highest likelihood of dying of a heart attack. That result never published.
It is remarkable. I mean, even in today's climate, when I've spoken about this a systematic review of the 40 top diets, right? And out of those, the 7, Dr. Steve Anton outlines with his team, the 7 that were the most effective of these diets, and the ones that had the double-blind placebo-controlled largest quantity and then produced the most weight loss over the most extended period of time were the ones that came up on top. And guess what? The one that came out on the very top was, of course, Dr. Atkins. And this low-carb diet, when you look at the individual participants that were part of these numerous studies, the ones that were doing the very, very best were the ones that ate the most fat. 50, 55%, the highest level of fat in their diets were the ones that lost the most weight, and they kept the most weight off. And then we just look at sort of what diets come out on top for this year alone, and what are they, and where does Atkins sit?
Right at the bottom of the list. I mean, the U.S. News and World Report just came out with their best diet cover story, the ketogenic diet, which is very high in fat, at the absolute bottom of the list.
Right.
And the Atkins, they have something called Atkins, and Eco Atkins are in the, towards the bottom of the list. And then you look at the expert panel. The expert panel is animal welfare activists, vegetarians, people who have, an ideological kind of activist agenda about what we should eat. And they're obviously not looking at the science for what is healthy. The number 1 diet on the U.S. News and World cover story is the DASH diet. The DASH diet has only been tested on hypertensive subjects, never been tested on a normal population, never been shown to help people lose weight, never been shown to help people fight diabetes, and has a mixed impact on heart disease risk factors, because while it lowers your LDL, your bad cholesterol, it also lowers your good cholesterol. Your HDL comes down. So in the end, it's just kind of a wash. Also, how many people have been tested on the DASH diet? Number 1 diet by the U.S. News and World Report? Not more than 2,000 people, which is tiny. Compare that to the number of people who've been tested on low carb. Over 6,300 have been tested and shown that diet to be safe and effective for all those conditions: obesity, diabetes, heart disease. So it's like they're just not looking at the science because they have some other agenda.
So going back to these guidelines that are considered here in the U.S. to sort of lead the global, they're the gold standard, and they get reviewed every 5 years. Can you share with us a little bit more about them and where things are going and what you see based on the science or the lack thereof?
Right. Well, I became convinced the dietary guidelines are very important, not only because they lead the world, but again, even though you may not think that you're going to go to a .gov website to get your dietary advice, the dietary guidelines reach you.
Of course.
They are basically downloaded by the professional medical associations, and then they go out to every doctor, every nutritionist, every dietitian, everybody working on the front line. So when you go to a doctor, nutritionist, dietitian's office, you get the guidelines. They also are what largely determine school lunches, women and infant children feeding programs, foods in hospitals, feeding programs for the elderly, the food stamp program, and the military rations. We happen to have an obesity epidemic in the military. And it's not like they don't exercise.
Wait a moment here. The obesity epidemic is also part of the military.
Yes, they have a huge obesity problem in the military, where you cannot blame them for not exercising enough. So what is that about? It's because they're feeding them food according to the dietary guidelines. So high in carbs, over 50% in carbs, and very low in fat. And that is, over time, I think that has been shown that is not a diet that helps you lose weight or keep you healthy. So the guidelines are just enormously influential on how people get, what people think is a healthy diet. They also really influence the food supply, because that little fact panel on the back of, food fact panel on the back of all food, that information is basically influenced by the guidelines. So, when you read, why are you thinking about fat, saturated fat, worrying about many calories come from that? That comes from the guidelines. It also affects the food supply. When 1980, when the U.S. government told everybody to go on a low-fat diet, like all cattle were bred to be lean. Lean meat, lean pork. Now we have completely lean pork. Low-fat milk. Consumption of whole-fat milk has dropped by 79% since 1970. So if you look at all the food trends in America, they have all followed the guidelines. You know, red meat is down 34%, grains are up 40%, vegetable oils are up 89%, fruits and vegetables have also increased by 20, 30%. Like, Americans really did everything that we were told to do. And that's because the guidelines are so powerful. You know, what do you learn in school? What do my kids learn in school? They got the food pyramid or
Right.
my plate, and then in the case of my child, he had like a little booklet on why vegetable oils were so good that was for some reason in his classroom, like written
Oh,
by
wow.
Monsanto. You know, my kids, when they come home, they're like, Mom, I said, just keep your mouth shut when they're talking about nutrition. You just don't need to raise your hand and tell them that you have bacon for breakfast every morning. Both my children at school are like, their coaches are telling them they're going to kill themselves on this diet. And you know, they've just learned, like, they just have
Wow.
to. So there's just, you know, that is the information we get from everywhere.
And how much pressure for a child. I know with my kids, again, I feed them in the same way that you feed your children. And it's the natural way for them to eat and gives them the energy and keeps them mentally focused and their blood sugar balanced. I mean, I'm doing it specifically for health reasons, and yet it is considered to be a fad or something that is new.
Or dangerous.
Or dangerous.
Worse, you're endangering your children. So the guidelines really need to become more evidence-based. They need to look at those randomized controlled clinical trials on tens of thousands of Americans, you know, paid for by the government. In order to inform our dietary guidelines, they need to actually reckon with those clinical trials and what they say. That's the most rigorous kind of evidence that we have. So, you know, I think that the dietary guidelines need to be updated so that they really reflect the science. They really don't.
And why do you think it is that there's an experiment going on, there's a war on our health going on right now, and it's proven out in the numbers, right? With the high level of pre-diabetic and diabetic individuals and the young children that are even dealing with diabetes, type 2 diabetes. It is a nightmare that we are living, and the obesity and the overweight just continuing to go up. Why is there not a war going on right now?
I think there is a bit of a war going on. I think we're in the midst of a real paradigm shift in nutrition. And I mean that the new science is pushing its way up. I mean, there are more and more academics now who are willing to stand up and say, we got it wrong on the dietary guidelines. There are more and more papers coming out concluding this is wrong, the advice that we're telling people. There's sort of, we think we've reached a kind of critical mass of PhDs who really who think we got it wrong on dietary fat. And at the same time, there's this kind of surge up from the bottom. This just, you know, hundreds of thousands of people who have regained their health by ignoring the guidelines. And their stories are coming up. And those doctors who are helping those people are starting to speak out. So I think that between this kind of top-down change in the expert community and this surge up from the bottom, I think that we will see change. But it really will not, it won't come easy. Let's say the status quo establishment is really fighting back, and they fight back hard.
How are they fighting back?
They really go back to the same kind of bullying tactics that Ansel Keys pioneered. They beat up on anyone who speaks out by, you know, claiming you're funded by the food industry, or your arguments are full of holes, or you must only be out to sell books, or, I mean, this is the treatment that I get relentlessly. And because I don't have the right degrees after my name, they'll say, you know, she's just a journalist. And it's been easier for me to stand up now because The Lancet came out with a full-page review of my book saying...
Talk about that.
So, you know, initially when I was just relentlessly attacked, I mean, really called nasty names by top scientists, and had this retraction effort for my paper in the BMJ. I mean, it's a brutal experience, you know, and it's intended to be brutal. It's intended to silence me and my voice so that I, you know, it would be much easier just to give up and say, like, that's too much abuse, right? And it's what any normal person would probably do. I just happen to be really stubborn. But and it's also a cautionary tale to other people out there saying,
Right.
don't stick your neck up because we will whack it. And I have talked to many people who say, I'm happy to support you from the background. I'll write you nice emails, but I do not want my voice to be out there because people know they'll be attacked. So what makes it easier for me now is that, I've had really excellent reviews of my book and my work by the British Medical Journal, the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition.
Right.
The Lancet recently came out and said, this book will make you mad, but we checked it and we looked at the science, and she's right. And you must reckon with this. But so I think that now this kind of, high level validation helps me fight back and say, look, it's not just me. There's really, a number of people who are making the same argument. And you must reckon with this truth that we've discovered about nutrition science. So I think that between this kind of shift in expert opinion, the willingness of experts to stand up and be whistleblowers inside their own field, and this bottom-up surge of people curing themselves by ignoring the guidelines, I think we will see change. I think that this paradigm shift is happening. And I think it will be a battle to get to the end, but I think that the next few years we really will see change.
You can't argue with the results that people are getting from a health perspective and the way that we feel when we incorporate more saturated fats, more good fats. I think the conversation around the bad fats is just really starting to happen, and it's something that you've been talking about for many, many years.
Well, really the central thesis of my book is that saturated fats, the kind of fats found in meat, butter, but also coconut oil, palm oil, that these fats were unfairly villainized and do not cause heart disease. So, I go through all the clinical trials that were done on them. Ultimately, more than 65,000 people tested all around the world to see if saturated fats would cause heart disease. And none of those studies could show that to be true. And then I go through sort of what is the effect of saturated fat on the body? It turns out that saturated fat is the only food known to raise your good cholesterol, your HDL. So if you go to your doctor and he says, your HDL is low, you really need to get it up. And, how do you do that? He's like, well, you can drink red wine or you can try to exercise more. But really the most efficient way to raise your HDL is to eat saturated fat. It reliably raises HDL. And the vegetarian diet consistently causes HDL to drop. So it turns out HDL is a much more effective marker of your heart disease risk. Actually, the most effective marker that we commonly measure is HDL over triglycerides. HDL is driven by saturated fat intake. Triglycerides are driven by your carbohydrate intake. So the diet that will best improve your heart disease risk factors and reduce your risk of a heart attack is high in saturated fat and low in carbohydrates.
So with the Lancet paper, that was rather recent, is that correct?
It was in August of 2017. So this is more than 3 years after my book is published. But, I think that this shows the paradigm shift, right? It takes people a while to absorb the information. And the fact that they felt that they wanted to stand up and say, we need to reconsider the science. But I think it also shows that this is experts at the very top saying we need to be our own whistleblowers in our own field, and we need to reckon with what's gone on in nutrition science. We can't, like some random journalist, she can't be the one doing this. We have to take responsibility for what happened in our field, and I think that's completely right.
It's really remarkable to think that 3 years later, out comes this paper that says, you were right, Nina was right, and here's why. Your book was a New York Times bestseller. And years later, the information is still coming out to prove your point. And I think exactly what you're saying. When I go and meet with professors across the globe at different universities, and you see the kind of diet that they're doing in their own colleges, in their own departments, and it's low carb, and they're getting into keto, and they're eating more saturated fats and putting coconut oil in their coffee, and I see it everywhere. I see it all the time. I think you make a really good point.
Well, and also I think scientists don't want to be caught having been wrong and being so behind the curve. They don't, at some point, the field is going to change and they will look like dinosaurs if they do not at least acknowledge that some of their assumptions need to be questioned and there are problems in the field. So I think that's part of the motivation. They need to not be on the wrong side of history. So it's interesting. It's not coming so much from the nutrition expert community itself. It's really coming sort of one step removed, more from the medical community. I mean, that's a community where they understand what evidence-based science is supposed to look like, right? They know that if a doctor gives a pill and says, oh, you know what, we did a clinical trial on this and it didn't show any benefit, but we're still going to give it to you. You'd be in the medical community, that would be laughed out of the, off the table, right? But that is what we do in diet, in nutrition diet. Follow this advice, follow this diet. We did a clinical trial, it didn't work at all, but here, I'm giving it to you. So it really is the medical community looking at the bad nutrition science that is saying, what is going on with that field? How can you advise diets that are not based on any good evidence or has actually been contradicted by the evidence that we have? So I think that's what's going on.
In 1965, you were telling us a little bit about what the average American diet was.
Yes, this is a really incredible discovery that I made, which is that, according to the best available government data that we have, which is admittedly not great, but this is what we have, it tells us that in 1965, Americans ate 39% of their calories as carbohydrates. So that is a low-carb diet. That's what we call a low-carb diet. And they were eating over 40% of their calories as fat. That's a low-carb diet. All of America was on what we would now call a low-carb diet in 1965.
What we would now call almost a fad diet or maybe a dangerous diet, to your point, right?
But all of America was following this diet.
Wow.
In 1965. All we have to do is go back to what we were eating in 1965. Do we need dietary guidelines? No, let's just go back to what we were doing in 1965. That would be perfectly a good solution.
When you look at the different oils that we ingest and the issues around vegetable oils, share with us a little bit more about some of the research that you've uncovered.
Well, one thing that I found was that vegetable oils, you have to understand, vegetable oils were new to America. They were not part of our diet until the early 1900s. Before that, like every Western country in the world, we cooked with butter and lard, period. And some tallow and maybe some suet, that's beef and lamb fat, but mainly lard, which comes from pigs, and butter. Then in the early 1900s, they figured out how to press oil out of seeds. It's really seed oil. It's not vegetable oil. Sunflower seeds, safflower seeds, cottonseed was the big one in the beginning. And initially this oil was used as industrial lubricants for machines. Part of what helped, when they ran out of whale oil, they turned to these seed oils for the Industrial Revolution. Then they discovered if they could put this oil, which was gray and smelly and disgusting, through a long process of like 15 steps, winterize, deodorize, hydrogenate. They got a product that smelled good and it looked like lard.
15 steps.
Yeah, at least. I mean,
wow.
It goes through so many steps. It comes in the factory steps. It's just incredible what they do to make this, comestible for human beings. So they came out with this product they could make it white and it looked like lard. So they decided and it was used, initially it was developed by Procter & Gamble. They had the initial patent for this, and they thought they would use it. They were candle makers and soap makers, so they thought they would sell it as, use it for candles and soap. And somebody said, let's sell this as substitution lard. So they did. They sold it as Crisco, and they told American women, give up your lard, the smelly, smells, and old-fashioned lard, and buy this new product that we scientists have made. So the rise in consumption of vegetable oils really is the biggest increase of consumption of any food product over the course of the 20th century. First, it was this hardened lard. Then came margarine, substitute for butter. That's also hardened vegetable oil. the oil itself, they couldn't figure out how to stabilize that. So not until the 1940s did they figure out how to sell oil in bottles, like Mazola oil and Crisco oil. And those products really became the staples of American kitchens. So sunflower oil, safflower oil. Then it mainly became soybean oil. They found out how to take this byproduct from soybeans and make it into, the most commonly consumed oil today. So I discovered that these oils were investigated. They were so worrisome, any kind of finding they came out with, they killed rats in the animal experiments, the hardened vegetable oils, made cells rigid and would sort of stick in cell membranes. That's what trans fats were. And that research just sort of disappeared, right? If nobody's funding the research, then it doesn't happen. So remember, NIH believes vegetable oil should be promoted. The American Heart Association believes vegetable oil should be promoted. The food companies are not going to fund research against their own products. So there's just no research on vegetable oils. And then the next thing I learned about vegetable oils came from one of my sources at a top vegetable oil company, Loders and Crocklin. And he said to me, there's a huge problem with these trans-free oils. So remember, when we got rid of trans fats were there because in order to make oils stable, you have to harden them through the process of hydrogenation. One of the byproducts of hydrogenation is trans fats. Trans fats, we found out, are bad for health. So they had to get rid of trans fats. But remember, that hardened oil, they hardened it to make it stable. And so now we have to just go back to regular old vegetable oils. Well, what is the problem with that? So this source of mine in this vegetable oil company, he says, well, now that we have these trans-free oils, they're not stable. And they are oxidizing. That means they degrade into hundreds of oxidation products. And he said it's a huge problem because every fast food chain, Burger King, McDonald's, you name it, they're all using these oils. And these oxidation products turn into like a witch's brew, were his words. They get hard like polymers, like hardened paint. And the workers were trying to scrape it off the walls. It was covering the walls. It was clogging up the drains of the fryers. The oxidation products were so unstable that when the workers took off their uniforms and they put them in the truck to go to the dry cleaners, they would spontaneously combust in the back of the truck because there's all these like highly unstable oxidation products. And then put them in the dryers and they would catch the dryer on fire. So it was this incredible state. And this is what we're consuming. And these oxidation products easily pass into the food. That was shown by this scientist I interviewed, in Chelamy is her name. They pass into the food, they pass into your body, and it turns out they seem to cause massive inflammation, septic shock even. The scientist told me the amount of these toxic oxidation products required to produce septic shock is surprisingly feasible with the regular average American diet. So what happened? The major companies, they came up with all kinds of solutions to try to make these oils more stable. They developed something called little silicone beads that you put in that tries to absorb all the toxic oxidation products, or they put these kinds of nitrogen blankets on top of them, on top of the fryers, so that they don't go into the air, these products. And all of this oxidation happens well below smoke point. So smoke point is not something that is reliable in judging these kinds of effects.
Interesting. And you really aren't hearing that much yet about the below smoke point issues. It's still very, very new, and people are understanding, okay, smoke point is dangerous, but it's these places that go below it that you're talking about.
Oxidation is happening even at room temperature. Mm-hmm. It happens with very little heat. And it happens because polyunsaturated vegetable oils, poly refers to multiple double bonds. So every single one of those double bonds in a molecule when it's heated just a little bit, or maybe there's a little bit of sunlight that comes into your kitchen, those double bonds open up, and each of those bonds reaches out and grabs an oxygen molecule. It binds to it. Oxygen, oxidation, inflammation. That's what happens. So olive oil is a little bit safer because it's a monounsaturated fat. It means it only has one double bond, only one opportunity to bond with oxygen. But, the idea that any of these oils, canola oil or any of these oils, are safe to cook with is really, is not true. So that's why they tell you to store oil in dark bottles, because even light will start this oxidation process. And the fats that are safe to cook with are saturated fats. Saturated. They're saturated with hydrogen. They have no double bonds. They cannot bind with oxygen. So that's what makes them safe to heat up. Heating up is what speeds up chemical reactions.
Right.
So what is safe to cook with are saturated fats. Lard, butter, coconut oil. The fats that humans have traditionally eaten, natural fats, naturally occurring fats.
Nina, thank you so much for sharing over a decade's worth of incredible research, investigative research that has been proven time and time again, not just through creating a New York Times bestseller, but through all of the support that you're getting now more and more through different communities and different papers. So congratulations, and thank you so much for sharing with us.
Thank you very much for having me. And I want to say thank you for helping get this knowledge out there. I really am grateful to you.
Welcome to this documentary. Max Lukavere, can you tell us a little bit about your background and where you spend your time today?
Yeah, so my background is as a filmmaker and journalist. I was pre-med in college, and I ended up double majoring in film and psychology, and I made a film as an undergraduate exploring my passions at the time, which ended up landing me a dream job anchoring and producing content for a TV network that Al Gore co-founded in the United States called Current TV. And it was this little watched sort of network. It was a startup, but that experience allowed me the opportunity to work with and learn from some of the best storytellers and journalists in the world, so Peabody Award-winning journalists. And I got to cover everything from health and science to spirituality to fashion to politics. I was a generalist, and I enjoyed the opportunity that allowed me. But my passions really have always been health, nutrition, fitness. And when I left Current TV to sort of, explore where I wanted to go with my career, having had all that, incredible experience under my belt, it was around that time that my mother started to display early signs of memory loss. And I didn't really know what I was seeing at the time. I had no prior family history of dementia or any kind of neurodegenerative disease. And certainly my mom was not old at the time. She was 58. She was a vibrant, spirited blonde from New York, And seeing and hearing my mom complain about brain fog and, problems with her memory caught me and my family completely off guard. And because I was in between projects, I was able to go with her to some of the top hospitals in the United States. I went with her to the Cleveland Clinic. I went with her to Johns Hopkins University down in Baltimore. And of course, she lives in New York, so we have access to incredible medical establishments here. But it was at the Cleveland Clinic in Ohio where my mom, for the first time, was diagnosed with a neurodegenerative disease. And that's when she was prescribed, the chemical Band-Aids that they often prescribe people with neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's. And that was a really traumatic week for me,
I'm sure,
to say the least. Yeah, I'm a pretty chill guy, but that week was the first time in my life I'd ever had a panic attack. Just thinking about what my mom was going through, my own ignorance, the sort of helplessness that I felt, and fear for what was sort of to come. And I began almost immediately doing my own research. As I mentioned, I had this background in journalism, and occasionally I would get the opportunity to cover stories that, involved health and nutrition and things like that. So, and I also had sort of over the course of my life, been really interested in health and fitness. So I knew where to find good quality research. And that was the first place, those websites, PubMed, those were the first places that I went when my mom got sick. And I just started, I began with a theory. My theory was that because my mom was young and because I had no prior family history of dementia, there had to be something environmental triggering my mom's illness. And I thought that to some degree, diet was probably implicated. And I began looking into diet and Alzheimer's disease. My mom hadn't been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, but Alzheimer's disease is the most common form of dementia. And so I was like, okay, well, there's got to be some answers that I could glean from
Right.
Alzheimer's research.
So as a journalist, as someone who is a professional communicator and the kind of training that you also had access probably to a lot of other people that the average individual who's looking up PubMed and is passionate about the subject, you had access in different ways.
Yeah. So, I definitely, initially was mostly paralyzed by my own fear. And so my research was, I started watching every single TED Talk that I could find on the subject. I started reading every book I could find on the subject. And I certainly began looking into the references sections of those books and looking up the research, the primary literature itself. I like to say that the whole time I remained skeptical of everything that I was reading, as I think a scientist should, but never cynical. I remained, always open to new ideas and new perspectives. And so at a certain point, I realized, I had a sort of aha moment where I realized that I have something very unique that very few people in my shoes, going through what I was going through with my mom had, and that was media credentials. I had a verified mark on Twitter, and that's power in some parts. And so I began reaching out to scientists, namely the researchers who were sort of publishing the research that I was reading, and I began asking if I could interview them. And initially I had access to a few websites where I was able to sort of publish things as a blog, but ultimately, I had the idea to create a documentary of my own, and I decided to do a documentary that I called Breadhead, which my aim for it was to be the first ever dementia prevention documentary. And so through using that as a vehicle, I began reaching out to researchers around the world that were publishing the studies that I was reading that really are working to prove that we have a say in our cognitive health. So I've interviewed researchers from Harvard, Brown, Cornell, the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, Sweden, Charité Hospital in Berlin. These are the top research institutions in the world. And I had the unique ability to go and talk to some of the top researchers. And a lot of the insights that I was able to glean from those interviews, I wrapped into this documentary, Breadhead, which I'm super excited to present to the world. But at a certain point, between doing all of my own research and having conversations with these researchers and then broadening out to clinicians who are the point of care providers that are actually translating what is discovered in science, I became an expert, in my own right,
So becoming an expert and really being able to sort of pull back the curtain on this information.
Yeah.
What do you see as a different platform that you have maybe in today's climate with social media and so forth? How do you see the differences?
Yeah, it's a great question. In a way, I look at my mom and I look at her generation, and I think that they were, in a way, sort of made unwitting victims of, the lack of information that was available to them. My mom got her nutritional information from reading the New York Times and whatever magazines were, she was reading, but they didn't have the internet. And today, things are different. We have all of the world's knowledge at our fingertips on our smartphones, in our pockets 24 hours a day. We've got PubMed, and certainly not all studies are free, but there are a lot of open access journals out there that allow this information to be read by pretty much anybody. Not everybody's going to have the ability or time to sift through all the jargon, for example, but the point is, we live in a time where this information is out there. Maybe 50 years ago, only the doctor could know about health. Only the nutritionist could, have the license to say that they knew anything about nutrition. But yeah, the curtain, I think, has been not only pulled back, but it's never going to close. So this information is out there, and I think it gives the ability for all of us to become sort of experts in our own health. And so over the course of my journey, it never sort of occurred to me that because I'm not a medical doctor, there was any sort of ceiling to the information that I was able to teach myself. I just kind of went at it with a sort of open mind and the fortitude to do the homework and to be vulnerable and to be humble enough to ask questions to people that know, more than me. But at the end of the day, research is out there, and you can go to any journal and read the introduction and read the discussion. And from that, you can glean a lot. They're all cited, so you can follow those links and read the introductions and read even if you can't interpret the data, even if you have no idea what a p-val, what an n is or a p-value is, or how to interpret the trials. I mean, there's a lot you can glean. And then when you match those research articles with the press releases that are put out by the universities, often to accompany those research articles, and you read the sort of layman's version and then you compare it to the data in the article, you can essentially teach yourself how to interpret research. And I'm not saying that that is in any way a replacement for, what you get from a, advanced degree, but you can learn a lot is what I'm saying. And, I think 50 years ago, I would understand if you came about health from a place of ignorance, but today I don't think that there's really an excuse for ignorance. I think, the information is out there and a lot of it's free. And social media allows you to access other experts and connect with them, and that's essentially what I did. So it's I think we live in a great time. I want to prevent others from becoming victimized in the way that I feel that my mom was.
And you as well, right?
Yeah.
If this was a diagnosis that had no family history, how does it relate to you and your own health?
Well, I guess, it's not even something that I learned necessarily. It's just, I intuited that whatever those early symptoms were that I saw in my mom that bubbled up to the surface, that led us to going to visiting those neurologists, wasn't something that developed overnight.
Right.
It's something that obviously, like all chronic diseases, took years to develop. And so it was a really strong call to action to me to examine my own diet and my own lifestyle and to make changes in accordance with what I was reading in the literature. So, I used to believe that my diet was near optimal. I was consuming a lot of grains, predominantly in their whole grain format, so I was in the 1% of grain consumers, okay? I was not eating refined white flour. I was eating lots of whole grains, and I kind of, my own diet was dictated by the notion that, eating more grains is better than eating less grains. So, I wouldn't touch white rice, but if you put a huge bowl of brown rice in front of me, I would devour it, and I'd probably go back for seconds. I would not eat any white pasta, but I would eat as much, whole wheat pasta as I could stuff myself with. As a young person who, I've never had problems with my weight. I was probably very insulin sensitive. I would still feel like over the course of the day, my energy was like a roller coaster. Mm-hmm. I would be starving by the time lunch would hit. Soon after lunch, before dinner, I would always find myself to be starving again, and I would never understand why that was. And yet I would continue to treat the withdrawal that I was feeling by eating more carbs and eating more sugar. And I just, I thought that that's what life was like, I didn't think that there was any other option. And as I started to explore the relationship between blood sugar and brain health and cognitive function, and ultimately metabolic health and body composition, I realized that grains were probably doing to me and my energy levels a lot more harm than good. And I realized that there's no human biological requirement for grains. This is something that we're sort of somehow led to believe, through television marketing and those pretty little heart logos on the boxes of cereals, that somehow we need to eat oatmeal in the morning or, grains with lunch, that somehow without them we're going to be, worse off. And there's really no evidence for that. I mean, when you look at the evidence that's out there to suggest that grains improve health, you won't find any. In fact, a recent analysis performed by Cochrane, which is this organization known for their systematic reviews of medical literature in partnership with the World Health Organization, when they looked at randomized control trials, which are the kinds of trials required to prove cause and effect, they found no good evidence that whole grains improve health. Whole grains might be benign if you're metabolically healthy, but the idea that they improve health, there's really no good evidence for that. So, I mean, if I'm putting things in my mouth, if I'm, consuming foods, I want to eat things that are improving my health, not keeping it static.
Right. So you're doing this research, you're learning what your mother really needs.
Yeah.
And through that process, you start to examine your own choices.
Yeah.
And as you recognize that grains are not going to improve your health, where do you go from there?
I realized early on that grains are essentially what they feed cattle in factory farms, which are deplorable, and I just started to really question the notion that I need to eat these types of foods. Simultaneously, at the same time, I became interested in learning about the foods that actually do improve health. And I realized that 9% of Americans consume the required amount of vegetables per day, according to the CDC. And I was very likely in that category. And so I started looking at, the mechanisms behind how vegetables might actually improve my health. And, the truth is vegetables are among the most nutrient-dense kinds of food there are. You take kale or spinach. Take spinach, for example. Spinach, it's one of the top sources, if not the top source, of magnesium in the diet, which is an incredibly important nutrient, which is required for hundreds of enzymatic processes in the body. It's a top source of dietary folate. It's an incredible source of fiber. These are the kinds of things that we need that actually improve health, right?
Lutein, it's incredible for lutein, and we need as much lutein as possible for cognitive health, as
Cognitive
well
health,
as the
yeah.
impact from blue light.
Exactly.
You're right. I mean,
Exactly.
spinach is like a rock star.
Yeah.
But you'd have to eat almost 2 cups of spinach every day to get the kind of lutein that we need.
Well, but spinach is not the only source. I mean,
That's
you can
right.
you can eat spinach, you can eat kale, you can eat eggs.
Yes.
Egg yolks are an incredible
Yeah.
source of lutein and zeaxanthin, which boost eye health. It boosts these are carotenoids
Yeah.
that boost brain health, and so these are the kinds of foods that we need to eat more of. Not grains. Grains are mostly starch. Okay, so mostly just chains of glucose, which is sugar. And a little bit of insoluble fiber, which basically acts like sort of sandpaper to your insides, and a tiny, tiny amount of vitamins. So why do we need that? There's no mechanism by which we need grains. I mean, certainly enjoy grains if you want. They're not toxic, but the notion that we need to eat them for health is just absurd. So spinach, kale, nuts, like the healthy fats found in nuts, extra virgin olive oil, incredibly healthy. I'm a big believer in eating, a moderate amount of grass-fed beef, which I think is a health food. Grass-fed beef is, packed with, again, carotenoids, lutein, zeaxanthin, which is found in the fat. Because cows that eat grass, which are packed with carotenoids, then those carotenoids embed themselves in their meat. So when you eat, grass-fed beef, you're getting these brain and eye health boosting carotenoids. You're getting, a biologically appropriate ratio of omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acids. You're getting CLA, which is, being studied as a potential fat burner and cancer fighter.
Right.
And, researchers speculate that it's access to meat, and in fact cooked meat, that catalyze the growth of our brains because it's such a nutrient and energy-dense food. And so, I eat a couple servings of grass-fed beef per week. Fatty fish is incredibly important, obviously. Fatty fish is, packed with DHA, which actually helps build your brain cells. This is really important because, for a long time it was thought that adult neurogenesis was impossible, that, our brains sort of reach their maximum size and power in our mid-20s, only to begin sort of a long, gradual decline until the end of life. But now we know that adults can grow new brain cells, particularly in the vulnerable memory center of the brain, the hippocampus, up until the point at which we die. So the fact that we're able to continue growing brain cells means that we need to supply our brains with the appropriate building blocks to do so. So by eating fatty fish and getting, DHA, which is a really, healthy source of fat, or if you're vegan, algal oil or krill oil, so vitally important. These are the kinds of things that boost health. Grains don't boost health. and especially if you're one of the 50% of the US population that's either diabetic or pre-diabetic, and you've essentially become glucose intolerant. Adding grains into that equation is a recipe for disaster.
So even for you, when you transformed your own health and you started to eat these, these fatty foods, these fish, the grass-fed meats, and tons of vegetables, what happened to your energy? How did your experience of the day, even, let's just take the day, change?
Yeah, so I mean, I definitely, once I started adopting this higher fat, low carb, high vegetable diet, I definitely noticed that my own focus and my own attention and my own ability to convey ideas improved. I'm a professional communicator, so for a living, I go on TV and I communicate these relatively heady ideas in a way that people can understand them. So I'm very attuned to whether or not I'm on or I'm off. And I noticed that once I adopted this diet, I was much more frequently on and way more infrequently off. And I know that I'm an N of 1 study, but the literature really validates the improvement in executive function that I subjectively felt in myself. And as a sort of happy side bonus, which has never really been my focus, but it's just nice along the way, is I inadvertently ended up getting in the best shape of my life as well. I exercise a lot, and I do it primarily for the benefit to my own mental health that I feel when I go to the gym. But eating a sort of lower carb diet and exercising in accordance with what I know to benefit the brain, I've gotten leaner and stronger than I've ever been in my life.
Why do you think, Max, that we've got it so wrong? How do you think we just went from, like, everything that you're saying right now is what we all want, right?
Yeah.
We want that improved cognitive function. We want to grow those additional brain cells. We want to live our lives in the best way possible. We want the side effect to be the best shape we've ever been in. I mean, we want all of these things. And you were in this place where you're trying to help your mother, and you recognize, wow, that could be me 20 years down the road.
Yeah.
And you discover this complete transformation for your life. And it's just so counter to the way we're living our lives in this country.
Yeah.
What went wrong?
Yeah, well, I think past generations have really been, they didn't have the internet, and so the only insights that past generations were able to glean about their own biology and their own health, unless they were doctors, were from the government or were from the media. And today, those forces still exist. Oh, and also food companies. Food companies and marketers, there were a lot of complicit parties in the information that was force-fed to previous generations. And today those forces still exist. We're still told by our government to include grains at every meal for good health. That's according to the My Plate eating paradigm put out by the USDA. Again, when there's no good evidence from randomized controlled trials. So that's not an evidence-based recommendation to include grains at every meal, because there's no evidence that grains improve health. So that's just one example. Take the demonization of fat that occurred over the past 50 years, because of really flawed science and the food industry really sort of seizing the opportunity to market and sell products to consumers that were in line with this notion that fat was somehow bad for us. This important nutrient that was so vital to our evolution was suddenly, over the past 50 years, something that humans should for some reason avoid. The food industry really seized that moment to sell very unhealthy oils to the public, but previous generations again weren't privy to dissenting voices. There were no opposing voices. The conversation just wasn't something that could be had, because if you weren't a doctor or you weren't a nutritionist or you weren't somebody in a high public office, you just had no access to any real information. Today, that's different. Today, we have, research that's out there on the internet on PubMed. We've got universities publishing press releases that everybody is privy to. We've got, books coming out on the subject. We've got TED Talks. We've got, health gurus. There's all this information out there, and you still need to be your own sleuth and do your own research, because everybody's different at the end of the day. So, for you've got to take these, nuggets where you can find them and put them into practice in your own life, and kind of experiment, be willing to observe your own health and have patience And if something's not working for you, you've got to be willing to sort of pivot from that. I mean, science is it's a method of asking questions, and we can all do science in our own lives. I think one of the most important things about, being your own sort of seeker of truth is to always be willing to challenge your own hypotheses and your own theories. So for a long time, once I learned that fat was not bad for me, I was sort of throwing butter on. I was like, butter's back. I'm just going to put butter on everything. I'm going to throw butter in my coffee and my smoothies. I'm going to wash my face with it. I never did that. But, we all have different genes, and some people, for example, might over-respond, to saturated fat, for example. So chasing saturated fat as a nutrient, there's really not a lot of good evidence as that, for that as being sort of a beneficial thing, and for some people actually may not be positive. Science, we don't know. So this is one of those instances where we just have to be willing to experiment and kind of, get labs and, be just sort of inquisitive about our own biology.
So, do you still chase butter, or?
I mean, I'll cook with butter, certainly, because it's a very stable, from a chemical standpoint, it's a very stable fat to use for higher heat cooking, and I enjoy the taste. So yeah, I'll use it when I want to, but I also don't chase butter consumption like it's this magical food. There's really no good evidence for that. I mean, when I think about oils and fats that there's really a robust body of evidence to show that it's actually beneficial, I think about extra virgin olive oil. There was a very large study performed in Spain called the Predimed trial, where they looked at extra virgin olive oil consumption on the order of 1 liter per week per individual. And they found that consuming that much extra virgin olive oil actually improved risk factors for cardiovascular disease, improved cognitive function, and also helped patients lose weight. So when I think about like where the evidence is, it really seems to be in favor of extra virgin olive oil as a dietary oil. And if you want to use butter, use butter. But I think like chasing it like it's this magical food, there's really no evidence for that. But is it tasty AF? Yes.
You mentioned the dietary guidelines coming from the USDA. Could you expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, so I mean, for the past couple of decades, we had the USDA food pyramid advising us to load up on grains, right? 7 to 11 servings per day if you want to be healthy of grains. Right. That food pyramid paradigm was an economic instrument more than it was anything else. And thankfully, the USDA food pyramid is retired now, but it's been replaced by the USDA MyPlate. And what does the MyPlate model still advise? For us to include grains at every meal. And there's no good evidence that grains improve health. The best you could hope for if you're metabolically healthy is that grains are benign. And in fact, if you are, working out and exercising vigorously, then you can use grains as a tool. As I mentioned, you can have a bowl of brown or white rice after a workout to replenish your muscles with glycogen. But to make that a sort of generalized recommendation to the American people, I think is doing a lot more harm than good. And so, that continues to be something that people are force-fed, no pun intended, today. And, again, I think it's an economic instrument more than anything else.
The USDA is an agricultural organization. How does that fit in? Like, how do you see that fitting into making the recommendations for the foods we should be eating?
It's a massive conflict of interest. So, I don't think that we should be taking dietary advice from the government, to be totally honest. I mean, there are incrementally like positive steps being made. Like food labels now have to list the amount of added sugar, I think, which is a step in the right direction. The FDA recently banned trans fats, or hydrogenated fats, I should say, from the food supply, which is positive. Few people realize that the processing of grain and seed oils like canola oil actually creates trans fats. So it's not like our diets are free of trans fats. They're still going to be present if you're eating, unhealthy grain and seed oils.
Explain that a little bit more.
So the grain and seed oils like canola, grapeseed, corn, soy, these oils are so heavily processed, and the processing of them damages the oils. And at the end of the day, a damaged oil is going to damage you. But these oils, one of the steps in the production process for these oils is a deodorization process that basically makes them tasteless and scentless, odorless. because these oils are not necessarily that way. They have to be processed so that they can be squeezed into every crevice of the food supply, right? It's these, like, you can take canola oil, you can put it in a granola bar, you can put it in a salad dressing, you can put it in pretty much anything, in pizza, and it has no flavor. So these oils are produced to be tasteless and odorless, and the deodorization process actually creates trans fats. And they've done research where they've looked at even organic, canola oil on the shelves at, regular supermarkets, and they've found up to 5% of the oil is actually trans fat, which is incredibly unhealthy. And if you consider the fact that, most people on average consume about 20 grams of canola oil per day, I mean, that's a significant amount of trans fat that you're consuming. And trans fat is toxic.
So in these 20 grams of canola oil, where are most people getting that? Because it's not necessarily what they're using in their frying pan to cook with, right?
Yeah, canola oil is found predominantly, and grain and seed oils, they're found predominantly in packaged processed foods and served to us in restaurants. The reason for that being is that they're very cheap. So like a restaurant is not going to use the highest quality extra virgin olive oil or grass-fed butter to cook their food in. They're going to use really cheap oils with high smoke points, like grapeseed oil, corn oil, soybean oil. And again, they're tasteless, so customers are not going to notice. So yeah, when you eat at a restaurant, the vast majority of time, when you're eating anything that's been deep fried or sautéed or, brushed with oil just before being roasted, they're, generally not, I would say 99% of the time, they're going to be from these really unhealthy oils. And then in the modern supermarket, they're most commonly found in granola bars, bakery products, packaged foods, essentially. So when people ask me how to shop, I generally will tell people to shop around the perimeter of the supermarket, because when you buy fresh produce, meats and things like that, you're basically avoiding those really unhealthy oils. They predominantly lie in the aisles where they're baked into the packaged foods that Americans are now eating, way too much of.
Do you see there's such a transition toward eating out, right? Like we eat out more now probably than ever before. And it's almost as if we've got a blindfold on, because unless you're understanding exactly what you just said, like how is this salad dressing at this restaurant being prepared?
Yeah.
They're certainly not necessarily using these, high quality, expensive cooking oils or salad dressing oils, olive oils, like you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, owning a restaurant's a hard business.
Yeah.
So restaurant owners cost cut wherever they can. And what's the first place that a restaurant owner is going to cut costs? In ways that are invisible. So by replacing extra virgin olive oil or grass-fed butter with these really cheap, tasteless oils, customers are never going to know. You can be in the highest end restaurant in your city, and chances are, if there's oil involved in the food that you're eating, it's going to be from these incredibly cheap, incredibly damaging oils. There's a huge health food oriented supermarket that's ubiquitous in the United States. I'm not going to name it, but if you go to their prepared food section, the salad bar usually, all of the prepared foods that are in that salad bar are made with canola oil. And they say it, right? They're non-GMO organic canola oil. But still, organic non-GMO canola oil, those are just wellness buzzwords to hide the fact that canola oil is incredibly damaging and incredibly easily oxidized. And you take that oil and you put it in this hot food salad bar and you have it sit there all day, exposed to heat, exposed to oxygen. Those foods are so unhealthy. And this is like a supermarket chain that's like marketed as being probably the healthiest place that you could shop in America. So again, it's like we're being thrown misguided nutritional direction from every which way. And that's, I think, that's one of the major reasons why our health is in the shape that it's in.
Some of the things that you've learned as you've gone into this low carb, higher fat diet for your own health, can you share some of the observations? For example, you were talking to me a little bit about salt.
Yeah.
I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah. So I've become really interested in salt and sodium as of late. Sodium is another one of these things that's been demonized for the past 50 years. We somehow see the craving of salt and salty foods as this moral failure, right? But sodium is a nutrient. People don't realize that, but sodium is a nutrient. And when you eat a lot of carbs and sugar, which causes your pancreas to secrete insulin chronically throughout the day, it causes your kidneys to unnaturally hold on to more sodium. So actually, the fact that we've demonized sodium for the past 50 years doesn't make a lot of sense from that perspective. And in fact, when you eat a diet that is low, if not devoid of processed foods, and you're eating a low carb diet, as I now am, and then you do things that promote accelerated sodium depletion, like you exercise vigorously, you sweat a lot, you drink a lot of coffee, which causes you to pee a lot, you actually need to be cognizant of getting enough sodium. And so since I've started, since I've become interested in sodium research, I've actually been adding more salt, healthy salt to my diet. And I don't go for the highly processed, refined white salt, which usually has a lot of fillers, and actually they add sugar to it and anti-caking agents.
Wow.
I mean, and it's also the salt that you normally get in packets. It's unnaturally pure. It's like just pure sodium. Whereas if you were to get, if you were to use, salt, for example, from an ancient lake or Himalayan pink salt, it's predominantly sodium, but there's actually a ton of other trace elements and minerals in it. So it's a much healthier salt. And again, if you're drinking a lot of coffee or you're exercising a lot, and by the way, coffee has been shown to be really beneficial to health. When you're exercising a lot and you're sweating a lot and you're losing sodium, you really need to be replacing those lost electrolytes. So when I think your average American who's eating 300 grams of carbs is told to watch their sodium intake, I think that that's the wrong advice. I think that the advice should be to, lower the amount of carbohydrates that you're eating, stop being hyperinsulinemic, let your insulin levels come down, and your body will naturally expel salt, or sodium rather. And in terms of like the benefits, when you eat a low sodium diet, it actually makes your body want to secrete more insulin. So that can lead to long-term problems.
Interesting.
Yeah, that can lead to problems long-term. And also, what I've learned is that sodium helps vitamin C get into the brain. And vitamin C is really important as an antioxidant, of course, but also to help the brain produce neurotransmitters.
My doctor actually put me on sodium
Oh,
several
really?
years ago, yeah. And everyone thought, what's going on here? But it was for those exact reasons. I just wasn't getting enough sodium
Yeah.
in the diet that I was eating, and I've always struggled to have enough sodium in my diet.
Yeah, when I'm going really low carb, when I'm aiming for like, ketosis, for example, when I'm trying to be in a ketogenic state, I definitely am conscious of my sodium intake. And when I wake up in the mornings, because we all tend to be a little bit dehydrated when we wake up in the
Right.
mornings, I will put a little bit of salt in water and drink that, and I feel it gives me so much energy. It's like it could be, again, I'm like an N of 1 subject here, but I definitely feel that sometimes in the morning when I wake up, I putting a little bit of salt in my water and drinking that, it makes me feel great. And then I drink a little bit of black coffee and I'm good to go. And on top of that, one thing that I'm really into is saunas. There's a lot of really good research now coming out on sauna use. And so, when you go into a sauna, you sweat a lot, you lose a lot of sodium. I keep a little vial of salt in my gym bag. And after I hit the sauna for a good half an hour to an hour, I go to my gym bag, I sprinkle some salt in my mouth. And
Great.
yeah, you don't feel that sense of persistent lightheadedness. I think that often accompanies, a good workout or like an extended sauna session.
Max, you've mentioned N of 1 a couple times. For the audience, can you just describe that a little bit?
Yeah, so N of 1, basically, when you look at any study, the N is the amount of subjects in that study. And generally speaking, the more the merrier. So when I say N of 1, basically what I'm meaning is that I am my own personal experiment.
Yeah.
I'm always willing to challenge my own theories and my own hypotheses and iterate in my diet by tweaking things here and there. And I think that we should all think about ourselves as N of 1 experiments. We should always be willing to challenge our own theories and to, be able to look at cause and effect, by doing certain things, seeing how it's going to reflect in the way we feel, in our body composition. And if things aren't working, be able to change. That's really what science is. It's not being sort of emotionally tied to any one outcome or any one variable. It's about experimenting and always be, remaining open-minded to, having your theories proved perhaps or disproved. And also, I don't want people to think that I'm projecting my own personal experience with my own diet and my own lifestyle onto other people. Like, you're different from me. You have a different, fitness background. You've got different genes or a different gender. And so, I want people to know that I'm not just like projecting what has worked for me, as something that I think will work for you. I think, everybody's different. So that's just my own little quick way of offering a disclaimer.
With the observations, the experiences that you hear from people, through your Facebook, through your Instagram, all over, through all of the television work that you do, what would you want the audience to really hear that they may not know that could be transformative in this journey around macronutrients and weight loss and brain health? You have a book coming out, I know.
Yeah. So I'm super excited to put out my first book, Genius Foods, which, I think is going to really help people in a big way separate fact from fiction and understand that, everybody, while everybody's different and there are, many individual tweaks that one can make to their diets in accordance with their genes, in accordance with their fitness levels, gender, there are also some salient takeaways that I think are applicable to the vast majority of people. And that is that, for the most part, we're eating way too many carbohydrates and we are way more sedentary than our ancestors. Even those of us who like to think of ourselves as being active are a lot less active than we were for the vast majority of our evolution. So, I think people should think about carbohydrates not as something that they need necessarily, but as something that should be a performance-enhancing tool. After you have a great workout, eat your brown rice. After you have an amazing workout where you've depleted your muscles of stored sugar, and they essentially become a sponge for the sugar that you eat, have your brown rice bowl. Have a sweet potato, for example. But for most people that are struggling with problems with their weight, that are hyperinsulinemic, that have chronically elevated levels of insulin, which may one day lead to them being diagnosed as pre-diabetic or diabetic, the notion that they need to, or that they should eat grains, or, that whole wheat wrap that they get every day at lunch, really not ideal. On the other hand, most people are not eating enough vegetables and all the micronutrients that vegetables contain. So, I would say one of the most practical takeaways that I like to give people is to just, eat a large salad every single day. Every single day, make that commitment to yourself to eat a large fatty salad. And when I say a fatty salad, I don't mean, throwing a bunch of tortilla strips and cheese and ranch dressing on top of it. I mean, take a bunch of dark leafy greens, douse them in extra virgin olive oil, because actually you need fat to absorb those precious carotenoids that we were talking about earlier, the lutein, zeaxanthin. The absorption of those really powerful brain-boosting compounds is negligible without a fat source. So, huge fatty salad. You want to have dark leafy greens, throw in some carrots, throw in some beets, lots of extra virgin olive oil, maybe throw in an egg. Have that every single day. Not only are you checking off so many of your nutritional boxes with a salad, it's a perfect vehicle for extra virgin olive oil. You're getting tons of dietary fiber, which your microbiota love. But research actually suggests that people that eat one salad a day of dark leafy greens actually have brains that look 11 years younger on brain scans.
Remarkable. Oh, I'm so happy I ate my romaine last night.
Yeah, you ate your romaine. That's
Yeah,
amazing.
every day. I agree with you. It's just that feeling that I think we get from eating dark leafy greens.
Yeah.
There's an energy that comes with it. But I love what you said about fatty salads, right?
Yeah.
So when we think about eating our salad, it's a vehicle, like
Yeah.
you just mentioned, for the good fats and making sure that you are getting the good fats, because salad dressings are just filled with so much garbage.
Yeah. So commercial, definitely by all means, avoid commercial salad dressings. They're usually the worst offenders. They're, usually canola oil or corn oil or soybean oil. These oils are really unhealthy. Yeah, instead make your own salad dressing. I'm obsessed with this salad dressing. It's not good if you can't eat it on date night. you're definitely not going to want to kiss anybody after eating it, but take a little bit of extra virgin olive oil, apple cider vinegar, nutritional yeast, which I'm obsessed with. Throw some like raw chopped up garlic in there.
Yum.
Super spicy. Throw in some salt, like Himalayan pink salt, black pepper. Black pepper actually enhances the bioavailability of a lot of the polyphenols in that salad. A lot of people are familiar with the ability of pepper to improve the bioavailability of turmeric, but it actually works for other plant compounds as well. By inhibiting certain liver enzymes that detoxify them, you're actually enhancing the biological activity of a lot of these plant nutrients. And so like it's sort of like a Caesar salad-y type dressing, but it's like really spicy and savory, and I just love it. And you can get crazy with it. Throw in some hemp seeds. Yeah, I mean, go nuts, go wild. Salads are like really great sort of petri dishes for you to just try all kinds of different things,
I love it.
Yeah.
So you wrote your book, Genius Foods,
Yeah.
with Dr. Graywall.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that choice to partner with him on this incredible book.
Yeah, so I met Dr. Graywall at a health conference, and I was just, struck by his personal story. I thought people really need to hear that this exists, that a person can go through medical school, which we citizens think of sort of as being like this, the end-all, be-all way in which a person learns everything there is to know about health, right? Like that Dr. Graywall could go through medical school and come out at the other end not knowing anything about how to fix his own obesity. In fact, medical school he credits as having made him fat because of the stress of going through it. But it didn't teach him anything about how to lose that weight and how to regain his metabolic health. So he basically has a story that in a way mirrors my own. Mm-hmm. Even though he's a medical doctor, we both sort of had to, out of necessity, become experts in these fields that we weren't experts in previously, that we were completely ignorant to. I had to teach myself about nutrition and brain health and metabolic health, and Paul had to teach himself about nutrition and brain health and metabolic health. And it's really kind of crazy that doctors are undertrained when it comes to nutrition and exercise, but it's a fact. It's actually been researched and published. Researchers have done surveys with medical students, and they find that they're really undertaught when it comes to these topics. And so me and Paul sort of have we've got very similar journeys in that sense, where we both, out of necessity, out of passion, really had this drive to become experts in topics that we weren't experts in, all motivated by personal passion. And I think it was like maybe 3 or 4 months after I had gotten my book deal, I met him, and I was just like, dude, let's collaborate. And I also thought, I really wanted to go deep into the mechanisms of health in Genius Foods. And there were certain aspects of health that, were sort of like gray areas for me that I wanted a real clinical perspective on. So I was very familiar with the research, but in terms of like a clinical perspective, that's where I really thought that having Paul involved, he would add a lot of value. So when it comes to cardiovascular health and separating fact from fiction in terms of cholesterol, for example, Paul added a really great perspective. So yeah, I'm really proud of what we've accomplished together, and Paul's brilliant. So
it's going to be great. I can't wait for it to come out and for everyone to have a chance to read it.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I'm pumped.
Max, this was unbelievable. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and guidance and curiosity into areas of our health and well-being that we can all benefit from.
Thank you so much for having me.
So how long does it take to get into this mode for your patients that you've seen, that you've encouraged them to start to understand how to burn their own body fat? How long does it take? Because I don't want people to feel discouraged, and I'm really curious about that.
So it does depend on where you're at, right? Like, so if you're a diabetic, for example, and you're on several medications for diabetes, it's going to take a little bit more concentration and focus and targeting how to make this transition. And that's where I just say, for that kind of a person, you just want to start with breakfast. But and you don't need to necessarily even think about changing your lunch and your dinner. And then you'll notice, like I say, people do notice they feel better, the very first meal. And then once they've switched over to making all the meals align with a fat burn program, then maybe a month at the most of a difficult transition, but then things just get easier and easier and easier. And by difficult transition, I mean, we're talking about people who might be on medications that will have side effects that they have to adapt to, and because when people are diabetic, that you have to change some of their medications around, or you have to reduce the medications. For somebody who's an athlete who is pretty healthy to begin with, maybe they have 50 pounds to lose, but they're otherwise well. They don't have insulin resistance particularly. That is a very important thing to not have, because insulin resistance means the door to that fat closet is locked.
With the padlock?
Yes, and a key code. Those folks can pretty much switch right over. They can start, doing what I like, the ultimate goal.
So you work with a lot of athletes?
Yes.
Okay, so an athlete's body is different than someone else's?
Yeah, athletes tend to not have insulin resistance, so that makes a big difference. So that makes them better fat burners. That tends to unlock that fat closet real easily. So they can just jump right to, the ultimate simple goal is to have one meal a day, right? So you maybe have some coffee or something, high fat coffee like I do in the morning, but then you just jump right to, I call it a super meal for your dinner, where you're packing in as much nutrition in as few calories, if that's your weight loss goal, as possible. I mean, if your goal is weight loss.
And for an athlete, what is their main goal?
Well, for an athlete, you know what? Athletes really want to be thin too. I mean, I've worked with a number of athletes in the NBA. They may have 10% body fat, but they want it to be 8, right? So they always are pushing that fat burn. Of course, they want to keep their performance up too. They can do just fine with one meal a day, just like anybody else. They just might want to. They can have more carbohydrates because they will be using them, right? So we were working with Dwight Howard, who had a terrible sugar addiction. And, people have been telling him to cut his carbs because he wanted to lose weight, like all athletes seem to. And he got to a point in the season where he had back surgery and he just wasn't healing properly. He was still having tingling and numbness in his fingers and toes. And I sat him down and got to talk to him and explain to him that tingling was coming from nerve damage that was due to sugar. And it was finally by explaining to him how sugar was actually damaging his nervous system and impairing his performance, not just relating to weight, that he decided to make the leap, and he cut out his sugar. He did go cold turkey, which he could because he was an athlete. And they carried the candy out from his house in boxes. He had it stuffed in his nightstand. He had it everywhere, in his couch cushions. It was totally like an addict. And when we got him to the point where he was burning fat, he said, he had a week or two where it was a tough transition, but his performance had improved so much that people were saying, the announcers were saying, the old Dwight is back. Superman is back.
Wow.
Because his performance had been kind of subpar for him that most of that season after the back surgery. Then there was another player, Steve Blake, whose wife was really into cooking, and so he had a lot of trouble with knee pain. In fact, he'd been having knee pain every game for 2 years. So he started working with me, and his wife started making bone stock, chicken stock. And within 2 months, the knee pain that had plagued him for years was gone. And he could play, big minutes without having any of the problems in his knees, the achiness and the stiffness that had been, he kind of had gotten used to having it. It was just gone.
Amazing.
If your a woman who's the average American woman, 460 pounds, your daily calorie budget, if you're, say, 40 years old, is somewhere around maybe 1,700 calories. So that's, first of all, it's important to know that that's less than the 2,000 on the label, right? That's when if you calculate your percentages. But you don't have a lot of spare in your budget there. If you're trying to get enough nutrition to meet, as many of the multivitamins and minerals and everything else that you need, all the protein and all the essential fatty acids that you can get from your diet, you don't have spare for empty calories. And carbohydrate-rich foods tend to have less nutrition per calorie, right? Like, so the fruits are very much higher in calories per unit of vitamins and minerals compared to vegetables. So you want to be not having so much of the fruits. You don't want to be having the starchy foods. But if you're an athlete, you absolutely can, because you're burning so much more off.
That makes so much sense. So from losing weight, reducing the obesity and the overweight, to disease and the neurological diseases that so many people in our country are suffering from, to the athlete that's wanting to perform that much better. This fat burning process that you're talking about can work with each of these groups.
The defining feature of health, no matter what age you are, no matter if you're a man or woman, is the ability to burn body fat for energy. It's what creates the difference between a healthy person and someone who's going to be going down that chronic disease pathway.
That's incredible.
So when your cell membranes are too high in this polyunsaturated stuff that comes from the vegetable oils, and they don't have enough antioxidants, it's very easy to spark off a free radical cascade. And that's a chemical term for something that's very simple that you've seen. Like if you've ever used lacquer, or if you've ever used epoxy glue, it starts out as a liquid, and then you squeeze it out of the tube, and a few minutes later it's a solid. Well, what that is it's a polymerization reaction. It's a very fast reaction that is occurring within the glue molecules and oxygen, right? So it's a similar thing that can happen on the surface of your cells and on the lipoproteins, like the HDL and the LDL, when your doctor measures cholesterol. When you get a polymerization reaction like that on a cell membrane, it's like you're developing a varnish over the surface of your cell membranes. And all of the important cell receptors and self-identifying molecules and the transporters, the ion transporters, the ion channels, and glucose channels, and all the things that are supposed to be on the surface of that cell doing stuff, they just get gummed up. It's like somebody just sprayed varnish all over a section of your cell, and suddenly everything that should be happening on that section comes to a grinding halt. And that, if it's a big enough spot, if it's a small spot, the cell can kind of clear it out and do a major cleanup. And, a lot of activity has to shut down. And the cell has to decide, once it starts doing that kind of a cleanup, is it going to live or die? And it may end up deciding to die or to try to die. And if it is just so disabled that it can't even properly go through that process of dying, which we call apoptosis, where the cell normally kind of neatly shuts itself down and takes itself apart, it just becomes a source of inflammatory compounds that affect the cells next door. And so it's a complete disaster to have these polyunsaturated fatty acids in our diets to the degree that we do, because this kind of thing can happen at any point. It's like we're all, if your diet is high in these polyunsaturates, you are kind of a biological ticking time bomb where who knows what's going to happen. It might be autoimmune disease. It might be Hashimoto's. It might be celiac disease. It might be lupus. Or it might end up being cancer. Or it might be ALS or another degenerative neurologic disorder like multiple sclerosis. It could be Parkinson's. Any disease. The vegetable oil diet, the high vegetable oil diet it's really an all-you-can-eat buffet of chronic disease. And you don't know what you're going to come away with when you go up to that table, but it's not going to be good.
And that high vegetable oil buffet that you're talking about, That's what most of us in this country are consuming. It's like you had mentioned 30% of our diet.
According to the statistics on what gets eaten in this country, it's called disappearance data. We produce enough vegetable oil that the average American is consuming somewhere between 25 and 35% of their daily calories from this stuff. And that's based on like the best data, right?
Wow.
And so it comes in the form of, your breakfast cereal has some, your Eggos have some. If you have an energy bar, it has some. And it's very high in a lot of the foods that we kind of know are bad for us, like muffins, right? And baked goods, any kind of baked good from that has any oil in it, it's going to be these unhealthy oils.
Why do we use those unhealthy oils so much? What is the thought process there?
One reason, they're cheaper.
They're cheaper.
Because they come from commodity crops
Right.
that are subsidized by the government. They are monoculture. You can mechanize the whole thing. You don't need to pay people, which are very expensive. And they have no flavor, so they're neutral. You can use them in anything. And their shelf life is like infinite because they're so highly processed that they don't go bad. They are bad. They're the source of bad.
And it's such a vicious cycle. When I sit back and I think about what you're saying, Dr. Shanahan, we're saving money on the front end with these oils that are a buffet of disease and paying for it on the back end in all of these different ways.
Absolutely. People talk about when people hear this kind of thing, sometimes the reaction is they're overwhelmed. They're just like, oh my God, yet another bad thing. It can't, how can it be that bad? How can this be true? Is it really, true? Or is this one more thing that's gonna change back and forth and back and forth? Another response is, well, this is just a fad now. It's a fad to be going back to saturated fat and to be going back to traditional foods, which seems ridiculous on its face. A fad to be going back to traditional foods. We were doing the same thing for generation after generation after generation. And in the 1950s and 60s, we stopped doing that. All came to a screeching halt, and we started an experiment. We were telling people to abandon the traditions that had sustained us forever and to start eating these new foods that didn't exist before the industrial era, right? Processed flour, refined sugar, to any degree, significant degree. There was sugar, but not hardly as much. But the vegetable oils never existed before the industrial era. They couldn't have. And that is an experiment. That is the experiment. And we've seen the results in the form of all the statistics on the increasing rates of chronic disease. And if you don't educate yourself on, what is it that people used to do? Right? It's nothing crazy. It's just what did people used to do? You educate yourself on that. That is how you exit this grand experiment that right now is playing out probably in your neighborhood, maybe even in your family. Hopefully nobody in your family, hopefully not you, like I was. But the way out of this experiment, into the light of good health, is just returning to the traditional foods that we're like genetically and biologically designed to love anyway. It tastes better. So it's a win-win. You don't have to sacrifice anything except for bad habits. When I learned all this stuff, the first thing I consciously did was start cutting down on sugar.
Thanks to your husband.
Thanks to my husband. But the other thing that I didn't even realize I was doing was, as soon as I decided that, butter wasn't going to kill me, I stopped eating all the vegetable oil. So I was doing two things at once.
Because when you say you were eating, how much sugar were you taking in the morning?
Well, just in my coffee, I made a caramel syrup, which had a 1/4 cup of sugar per serving.
Wow.
And then, I would have, the rest of the day, I would have more too. I'd have fruit and the usual kind of junky American diet.
So you cut down on your sugar, but I know from my addiction to sugar, and I know that corn syrup that's hidden and taken over for even cane sugar, how much more addictive that is, and then all of these different sweeteners, that's not easy to do. So how were you able to cut down on your sugar?
Well, I had fortunately kind of consolidated most of my junk and like my daily treat. My whole like mind was wrapped around this at 10:30 in the morning because I started work at 1. I would have my coffee treat, right? And that was it for the day. I had that much discipline where I wouldn't have any more like total junk.
I have none of that discipline. Okay.
So, and I think that might be key also because I've shared that with a number of patients. You consolidate your treat into once a day, and then you start chipping that down by gradually reducing the amount of sweet in that, which is exactly what I did. And I had the luxury of actually making it myself. So I just put in less caramel sauce in my coffee. But you could do that if your treat is like, a Starbucks mocha frappuccino.
Right.
Just ask for, instead of 4 squirts, 3, and then 2, and then, just gradually pull back. And as you do that, you will find that you don't miss it actually, because sugar is addicting not just for your brain but for your taste buds. Your taste buds start to wake up and they can sense sugar better. And the other big thing though, which is why it's so important to mention, is that I also cut out the vegetable oils. I cut those out. That was I did that first. There was no addiction there. I just cut them out and started eating butter. And that enabled my taste buds to wake up. Because once you get that inflammatory garbage out of your diet, your digestive system doesn't have to protect itself from the onslaught of all those free radicals. And so I felt like my taste buds were really working for the first time. And I had been one of those people where, they said, oh, well, I heard that like carrots, had sugar in them, and that some people were like, oh, carrots taste sweet. And I was like, you're nuts. And I didn't think I was ever going to be one of those people that could detect sweetness in carrots. But once I got the sugar concentration down and got the vegetable oils out of my life, I was like, wait a second, these things are sweet. There is sugar in here. And I just actually enjoyed food, just regular food.
How long did that take you?
It took probably about 3 months once I started in earnest, like really consciously cutting. I had unconsciously cut out the vegetable oils at some point. I don't even remember. It was unconscious. I don't know when that happened. But it took me about 3 months to get off the sugar. And it was all happening around the same time.
And so you first consolidate your consumption of sugar. Like I know for me, when I need that brain sugar, right? I need that glucose to my brain because I'm getting foggy and I have to perform and I'm a CEO and I've got all these things going on. It doesn't matter. I will just start foraging for sugar in the office, and I'll run to my assistant's desk and try to grab some chocolate, and I can't, it's an addiction, right?
Yes.
So that took me a lot of time to understand that consolidating it is the first step. And then you're saying once you start to consolidate it, even before, if you can feed your body the good fats.
Right, so you can start getting energy. It's
Right.
a quest for energy.
Exactly.
It's not just a quest for that taste and that dopamine release. It's a quest for energy on a very fundamental level. You can't deny that. So you have to provide an alternative energy source, and that's where the healthy fats come in.
Interesting. So I know so many of my friends, when we get that feeling, that desire for something sweet, if it's a brownie, if it's that Dunkin' Donuts that they're driving past, whatever it may be, it's almost impossible to control that. So as we're going through this 3-month cycle that you're talking about, what would you have sort of in your back pocket to help get through that moment? Like, what do we give ourselves to feed ourselves that energy while we're starting to adapt to good fat?
Well, a lot of times, if it's just where you happen to be driving past something and you
Yes.
see it and it's that trigger, it's not a need for energy. It's just a craving at that point.
Okay.
And so those are easier to fight off because science shows that most cravings only last 5 minutes. And so if you
I don't think mine lasts that short. It seems like I keep thinking about that.
You have a good attention span. But chewing gum,
Right.
it helps a lot, right? So sugarless chewing gum, or even like a flavored water, something like that. Just something to get you past the craving. And as you get better and better at accessing energy, and you realize how much better you feel when you just stay away from this stuff, you believe it, then you just don't even want it anymore. It's just like so many people say when they quit cigarettes, they don't want them anymore. It's not, when people successfully have quit, they just don't have the craving.
Right.
And they also don't do I just have one cigarette. either. They don't go back on that because they know that's a dangerous, slippery slope. So it's the same. And that's how I feel that I work best. And, not everybody is there yet. You have to go, some people do have to go gradually. I couldn't, do the all in right off the bat. I had to go gradually. But once you get there, it's important to realize that you want to try to focus on how much you are not wanting that stuff you used to want, and hold that faith when somebody's saying, oh, just try this truffle that I made from scratch, right? And you're like, well, I wouldn't do this on my own, and you don't want to upset your friend, but you'll take it, but you can give it to somebody else later when they're not looking.
So how do you make the distinction between being a fat burner and a body fat burner?
A fat burner is somebody who has a diet that's low in carb and high in easily burnable fats, like the monounsaturated and saturated fats. So they burn off those fats that they just ate. Somebody who's a body fat burner burns their body fat. And the way to make the leap from following a low carb, maybe a ketogenic diet, where you are burning fat, but maybe it's not your body fat, to burning that body fat that's where intermittent fasting comes in. That's why I talk about a super meal. That's why I talk about just eating one meal a day. Skip your lunch, because it's that time between meals that forces your body. Now, you have the enzymes for burning fat. Your mitochondria have got those transporters and everything that they need to be able to take fat that's been delivered to the cell and burn it. Your insulin isn't there blocking the door to the fat closet. So now you can release body fat and just burn that, but you need that time between meals. And I actually feel like we should talk about, we talk about 3 macronutrients right now. We've got protein, carb, and fat. But I feel like there's a 4th, and that time between meals is the 4th.
Interesting.
Because that's the key to getting your body to burn body fat. That's the key to getting your liver to convert the released fat into ketones, so that you are manufacturing ketones. You don't have to have ketones.
So timing matters?
Timing is everything when it comes to following a low-carb diet and making the transition from being a fat burner to being a body fat burner.
So I've spent a lot of time throughout Asia studying collagen and all of the great benefits that so many Asian women have with their skin, and certainly you see and enjoy bone broth every day, but what is it about the bone broth that was so helpful with your athlete?
So when you take collagen, the cartilage, the shiny wiggly stuff at the end of those chicken bones, the skin even, and you boil it in water for hours and hours, which is what it takes to make chicken broth, with a little bit of an acid that comes naturally from delicious vegetables, you are breaking down that collagen into very special molecules that have long names like proteoglycans and glycosaminoglycans and collagen hydrolysate. And each one of these has an ability to stimulate the cells of our body that produce collagen. They're called fibroblasts. They're in our skin. They're what makes the collagen in our skin. They're in our joints. They're what makes the ligaments and what makes the joint fluid that lubricates our joints, and it stimulates them into doing their thing. So it's kind of like a growth hormone or a youth serum. And it's a sort of a missing food group from the American diet. And, there's this idea that Caucasians, we're just we got the short end of the stick with our collagen health, because the darker skinned, Asians and African Americans, they don't get wrinkles the way we do. I think a big part of that is because in this country, particularly, we don't get the benefit of all that stock that's such a huge part. I mean, people in Korea, I have a Korean chef friend who says that they just drink a cup or 2 of bone stock every day.
Right.
Instead of tea, actually.
In this country, it seems like we're trying to make everything boneless, skinless, thisless. And my experience throughout Asia is it's the exact opposite. Women, when they're cooking at home, they're looking for as many bones, the joints, the donkey hide, as much as they can get into their bodies and into their families' bodies as possible. And they all know that that's what makes their skin so extra beautiful and reduces the wrinkles and fine lines.
I think it's so amazing how the chefs know this, right? So
Yes.
in deep nutrition, we call we give props to chefs and people who love cooking because they really are the original nutritionists.
Yes.
You know, they use their sense of skill with cooking and their senses, their sense of smell and their how things look, if they look appetizing, and of course the sense of taste, to craft a nutritious and tasty meal, you know, going on their instincts. And that's how nature set it up. Good food that's good for us when we use all natural ingredients is what we need. Good food tastes good. And we have this idea that, you know, it should be convenient, it should be, you know, it's going to be bland, it's just going to fill us up, you know, big piles of white flavorless stuff, pour on the salt maybe for some flavor. But that is so far from what a real chef would have us do. And, you know, when you go to the fanciest, most expensive restaurants, there's not a lot of carb there. And there's a lot of, you know, concentration and intensification of flavor. There's a lot of techniques that go into that. And it can be, you know, it can be an all-day affair, or if you have a really good stock, that's basically instant soup waiting to happen. All you have to do is throw in some thinly sliced meat and some fresh vegetables that cook quickly, and you've got a soup in 5 minutes.
And it's not only nourishing you from the inside, it's making our skin glow and be beautiful on the outside.
And it's good for our hair and our nails and even our arteries.
It's like our beauty soup.
It is. It's good for the intestinal tract. I mean, it's fantastic.
Dr. Shanahan, this is so remarkable. I can't thank you enough for sharing your wealth of knowledge with all of us. Transformative.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to speak with you today.
So excited to be here. We are in John Hardy's kitchen, and we're going to have the chance today to really sort of take all of the science that we've been learning about and bring it right into the kitchen. This is where we see how people, just like you and I, are able to benefit from the high-fat ketogenic diet. So John, thank you so much for having us. This is a beautiful kitchen.
Thank you so much. Yeah, my name is John Hardy. We started a ketogenic and paleo meal prep company about 4 years ago. I've been eating keto for about that time. I was in a place in my life where I needed to shed some weight. I read a particular book called Well Fed and started getting into meal prepping myself. We're based in Salt Lake City. We have about 30 clients, and we focus on higher quality, healthier fats in all of our meals. Basically, we source from as local as possible. You know, our growing season in Utah is pretty short, and so we're down at the local farmers market during the summer, and we utilize a lot of resources from there. Not only farmers, but we could also get, you know, a few other purveyors, vegetables, some of our meats, to try and keep it as local as possible. And then we kind of utilize those resources in our meals. We've only got we're basically personal chefs so that we can kind of meet people and their expectations of what they need, whether it comes down to calorie counts or particular allergies. You know, we really focus on not trying to overcomplicate the foods, really just focusing on better quality, simplified foods.
So talk to me about the healthy fats that you're bringing into your clients' lives.
Fats are really underappreciated, you know, in the ketogenic diet. I mean, it's the macro distribution which is pretty much the distribution of your calories, is going to be completely opposite of what, you know, the standard American diet is. And so what we really focus on is like the transition from these high carb diets, processed foods, and bringing clients down into a lower carb diet and increasing those fats and making it as comfortable as possible for clients. I see a lot of people that want to make these transitions but have no idea. We incorporate, you know, our cold pressed olive oil. We do the organic cold pressed coconut oil. We use avocado oils. We also render our own lard, our own tallow. So. And then we have used Schlitz in the past as well, which is a chicken
okay.
fat. It's the same.
And how do you get that chicken fat?
Well, you break down chickens and you use all the bones,
Mm-hmm.
and we add in some spices and some vegetables, and it's just the same as kind of a reduction, and you skim off the top, and as you're reducing and skimming off the top, you get Schlitz.
Interesting.
So it's underappreciated fat.
Yeah.
But that's kind of the world that we're in, is really utilizing not only these flavor concepts, but different types of fat. And it really depends on if what type of keto our clients are in. There's some clients that don't want animal fats, and so we have to incorporate more plant-based fats. I classically get clients that are eating not only sugar, but a lot of flour and a lot of preservatives. And that takes a lot of time to get out of your body if you're not actively eating clean. So what we do with clients is we don't actually worry about calorie count at all. And we just transition them into eating clean. And that generally looks like getting them a bit more carbs for the first little period.
So more carbs.
More carbs, because they're coming off of such a high carb distribution with their macros and where they're getting their calories. If we were to just reduce them immediately right into keto, they would get like a withdrawal. They would go through the low carb fog. A lot of people start to panic, and then they end up carbing up in the evening on like some sort of fast acting carb, which is the worst carb for you, like a sugar. And then it restarts, and then they get frustrated, and then they get depressed. So, I try to get clients to kind of step back a little bit and really focus on like, let's get you eating clean with some of these, some of these starchier carbs. They still have some sort of nutritional benefit. They're not considered keto, but let's just get you eating clean. So we'll start them on a rice, on a quinoa, and then a sweet potato.
So a rice, like a brown rice or a white rice?
Organic brown rice, organic quinoa, sweet potatoes. And so we kind of lean them into depleting those carbs and thereby the glycogen they've got built up. And so then once they got their diet together and they're not implicitly eating, and I should also note, like, if they, depending on what type of issues they have, a lot of them have sweet tooths. So we'll put together fat bombs, and
tell us about fat bombs and why you like them.
I mean, fat bombs is like an inherently keto snack. There are millions of recipes out there. It's just a heavy fat load that you can take with you. It's, organic raw cacao is really low carb. We use organic coconut oil. I can't divulge everything, but it's,
No, but just roughly, so they're low carb.
They're low carb snacks that have a little bit of a sweetness to them because the raw cacao is actually quite bitter. And then what's difficult is we start to get into artificial sweeteners, and I try and eliminate those as much as possible. But this is something that we just do just for clients that have issues with sugar.
With a sweet tooth.
With a sweet tooth.
So for the people who don't have a sweet tooth,
if you don't have to snack, inherently, a lot of the clients really have issues with snacking.
Yeah.
And it's empty carbs and empty calories that they don't need to be doing. So I try and get them to focus on, like, what are you really putting in your body, and they have to kind of think about it.
Yeah.
And then they come back to me and say, you know what, I've been eating more of this or that. And so yeah, we knock that out if you don't have a sweet tooth. They have a sugar issue with sodas. I have gotten clients that drink 3 or 4 sodas. I tell them to get a soda stream
so they just
or
get
something that's carbonated.
Yeah.
Be careful of like the artificial sweeteners in, you see a lot of these in grocery stores. Just the way that artificial sweeteners just like reduce the amount of stuff that's in your food. If you can just carbonate water and keep it in its form that it's supposed to be, then and then maybe a little bit of lemon juice if you want flavoring. But some people miss that carbonation,
right,
and realize that they don't need the empty sugars and all the calories that come with it. So those are 2 big things. If they're missing flour or breads, it's kind of like tough luck at this point. We haven't really developed, although there's keto breads, there's...
Like with almond flour and things like that?
Yeah, as far as, that's something we haven't really crossed over into just personally, but that's definitely something, we replicate a lot of the go-to starches. And so, yeah, we don't do the breads personally, because I think that's a little bit challenging sometimes because you can make gluten-free breads, but it's still carby. And we just haven't really experimented a lot with keto breads. But with rice, we get a lot of clients that miss rice and miss pasta. So we rice cauliflower regularly, and we put that into we might be making some today, where you make a dirty cauliflower rice. You can go into a variety of different vegetables with mirepoix. And then as far as noodles, they're always shiitake noodles. They're yam noodles. They're 0 calorie, although we use zoodles are really trendy. And so
there's zucchini.
Zucchini. And you can zoodle actually anything. So we can zoodle carrots, you can zoodle turnips, anything that's got kind of a firmer texture. And so we utilize that is to kind of replicate some of the foods, but in a lower carb version.
And what about your clients that want to really have the plant-based keto life? Can you tell us a little bit about how you feed them?
Yeah, I mean, much more difficult for sure.
But not impossible.
But not impossible, absolutely. You can utilize the coconut oil, obviously avocado. We have some clients that are vegan, that we utilize kind of tempeh, although, just getting them their protein we really struggle with, I guess. So it's plant-based keto is definitely much more challenging, but it definitely needs even more planning
to be successful.
Yeah. Absolutely. But everything's doable with the right amount of planning, the right amount of education, and I think the right amount of kind of guidance, and making, just tightening up meal plans and making sure that the snacks and there's just, I think a lot of these tracker apps are really beneficial.
Yes. Tell us a little bit about your relationship to them. And
yeah, I mean, I started with the tracking app because I literally was not even conscious of the amount of stuff that I was putting into my body throughout the day. And I think just having the awareness of the amount of calories from these different snacks or whatever else, there's an objective measure, and certainly an enlightening experience to what happens when you track everything. And it can be a little bit of a pain, but I realized when I was straying away, what I was really doing was sticking my head in the sand and not trying to be kind of aware of what I was putting in my body, because I knew I was not treating myself that well. And I think at a certain point, it's a hugely beneficial. There are people that absolutely want to track everything, but with keto, it's just about macros and trying to source everything that you're putting in your body the right way.
So you talk about tracking and using these apps with your clients. How do you make sure that they're transforming their macros in the appropriate way? Can you talk numbers?
Yeah, I mean, if you want a strict, where you're for sure in keto, it's going to have to be, 25 and below net carbs. That's kind of what we focus on. My understanding of anything that's technically ketogenic is, are below 80. But below 25, you're burning, fat as the primary source of kind of your energy. And so what we'll do is, we'll start with that number, and then we'll build from there. Like I said, it's really difficult to kind of get some of those fats in the other meals, and so we'll kind of put together a fat sauce. So we kind of incorporate organic olive oil. We'll do like a heavy whipping cream if they can source from animals. Those are kind of two, and then like spices, we'll put kind of either tomatoes, and we'll kind of incorporate some mirepoix and just kind of reduce it down. Or we'll do like a mushroom deglaze. And anyways, we're constantly rotating the fat sauce just to make it kind of interesting. I think it's more beneficial that way to round out the types of fats instead of just sprinkling, cheese on it or something like that, something that's really calorically dense, but not checking off multiple kind of parameters. So we would incorporate that. We'd really restrict their types of vegetables into really green, fibrous carbs that are much higher, obviously, with the net carbs with fiber. And
Give us some examples of some of your favorite fibers.
I mean, kale. Actually, eggplant is considered keto. Spinach. Those are the three green fibrous. Some sort of broccoli at times, some onions, but certainly trying to diversify that. It's a restrictive. That's just how it is. When you're talking 25 net carbs, you have to be like completely on top of what the amount of vegetables and everything that you're putting in your body. But it is very restrictive. It makes up the smallest portion of your meal size. It's really where you're getting your fat and then your protein. And people should be also aware of how much protein they're putting in your body, because if you eat too much protein, you can throw you out of keto as well. So
Right, because the protein can transform into
Exactly.
the carbs. I love this idea of really having these fat sauces and incorporating it in that way, because so much of the time, I can eat 3 avocados a day and I'm happy to do it, and then taking spoons of oil. But when it's spiced and it's part of the dish, it's just exciting and interesting, and you're getting these variety of fats, like you said.
Yeah, no, and clients love it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really tasty. And whether or not it's something you can eat every day, everything, but, we all need variety, but certainly incorporating avocados is another really positive way. It's something that, clients generally need to do on their end, just because it browns. But we're a big fan of avocados. We make like an avocado sauce as well. And so we're just constantly kind of coming up with different sauces and rotating as to what's in season to, to kind of drizzle on top of these meals to keep clients into keto.
So this message around when we first drop the water weight, everyone gets super excited, and then we plateau. How do you sort of manage through the plateaus, and are there a number of plateaus that you found to occur?
Yeah, I mean, there's always reasons why people are plateauing. Either they have been eating really strictly and your body's adjusted to what you're eating and you need to change something with your eating habits, or they haven't been eating as strict as they think they have. And so I always ask, can you tighten up your foods? And then if they have been doing that, then we use fasting. And
tell us a little bit
so
about it.
Well, there's 2 different ways. I mean, we advocate like a bulletproof coffee method, and so we'll do the organic coconut oil and Kerrygold butter, and then whatever types of spices that they and so we'll close that feeding window into a much shorter amount of time, and that will generally kickstart their body into really reprocessing the fats and getting reburning. And so they'll get them through that plateau in general, as long as they can keep everything else fixed. And so, obviously intermittent fasting is like a big tool that you can utilize. We just need to reinvestigate what's going on with plateaus, if they still, because it always happens. And I tell clients, don't panic. We have, tools to figure this out. And also in time, and also sleep schedules. I mean, there's a lot of other things that don't have to do with food. That if they're stressed out, if they're not sleeping well, sometimes they'll have a bad week and they'll panic, and they just need to calm down. If it's all the food habits have been the same and it's been going on for about 2 weeks, then we start to look at it. But I think there's generally a big panic with, oh man, this isn't working anymore. What do I do? I need to start something else. And it's sometimes you just need to be in it and just let it happen. I think that's what's so difficult. It's trusting the process.
And you've been on it for so many years that you can really, when you get those 10 p.m. calls that you pick up, which by the way is amazing, and incredible, that your clients have that relationship with you to really, at any point in time, be able to ask you questions, and then just your history yourself. You're walking the walk, and then you're bringing in, these tools. It's remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, I can bring in my own experience.
Yeah.
I sometimes with these other clients, they have some serious allergies to foods, and I don't have, those types of relationships with the food. But because I've been through this whole experience, and now here I am 4 years in, dealing with guys that are just starting, so I can see a lot of myself. And so, you know, the more people that we see, the more I can identify, yeah, I've seen this before, or, you know, I had a guy that had this issue, and just, you know, building that type of wealth of knowledge, I think is really helpful for clients.
This is incredible. Let's get cooking.
John, what is this?
So this is pork belly that we have been curing in the refrigerator for about a week.
Wow.
It turns into bacon.
Pork belly turns into bacon.
So pork belly
So
turns
many
into
of us
bacon.
don't know that.
Yeah,
Like
I mean,
me.
it came from a full belly. We've just kind of cut it down to size for this. But, you know, bacon, obviously, the keto breakfast that we serve. And this is one meal that I get clients to do for themselves because it's just so simple. And it's really dependent on a breakfast meat, typically in high fat. So bacon, obviously, we cure this ourselves.
Can you show the camera this part?
Yeah. I mean, you can see the kind of cross cut here.
So this is half of the pork's belly.
Belly, yeah. It's
right?
about a 10-pound belly.
Yep.
So I'll cut a few here.
There's so much of the fat in the pork.
Yeah, so an underutilized fat resource is definitely pork belly drippings. And so I just get clients, you know, usually they want to prep their own breakfast. We get clients to do their own bacon, eggs, free range when possible, which we're doing right now. And we're actually going to use the drippings. The drippings are a really important way to
What
kind
are
of get
the
that.
drippings?
I mean, it's the renderings of the fat,
Right.
essentially. I mean, pork belly is almost purely fat. So we'll deglaze a pan, we'll take the pork drippings, and then we'll actually put it on top of our meal. And that's a way to increase your kind of fat load with in that particular meal. So breakfast is a really important time that you can increase fats with, you know, if you're not doing fasting, this is
Right.
another way that you can really get a lot of healthy fat.
And starting your day with fat first always.
This is one way, you know, instead of bulletproof, and sometimes I personally I rotate off of like Whole Foods, and then sometimes I don't have time, and bulletproof is a really good kind of option. But when I have time to implement this, then I'll do that.
Awesome.
And so we're gonna sear this, and so, you know, we kind of just focus on, again, like peppers, onions, mushrooms, a whole variety of different vegetables. We use high heat, so we use a cast iron pan, and it retains the heat a lot better. Obviously, the sear is going to be really important here when you're rendering the fat. We've also utilized in this you can either rotate between, if you really want to increase the fats, olive oil or lard, which is more pork fat, although frankly, you know, this will render down to quite a bit of fat. So yeah, I mean, we're not rewriting any book here on how to like sear bacon in a pan, but this is a good idea. This is like the go-to. And then what you can do is with consistencies, you know, eggs sometimes they don't keep as long as people like for their meal prep, and so we will rotate the consistency with a frittata, but still utilizing the same types of ingredients, omelets. We've played around with eggs to order. This is kind of where I think our clients have to make a decision as to how important the sourcing of their ingredients is. And, you know,
How important is it?
I mean, that's how I was like, that's where I started, was local and seeing these farmers come in off the motorinos, and I could put a face to my food. That
Nice.
we're huge in that. I mean, we utilize our farmer, you know, 30 miles north up in Centerville, there's no spray, or, you know, these eggs, and this pork is from another farmer down here in Provo. So yeah, right here we'll use all these rendered kind of pork drippings, and we'll sear all our vegetables in the same pan.
Yeah.
So we utilize, you know, always the protein first, so we get those natural fats.
John, what I think is so interesting about what you're saying here is this is the way, like, our parents cooked in the 50s, right? You make your eggs in the same pan as the bacon, and you're
Yeah.
using those renderings, and that was the normal way.
We're just trying to bring those back. I think people are getting back to that now.
Nice.
So we're gonna pour in the eggs. These are free-range eggs from a local farmer that we have down from the farmer's market. And then we're gonna season it now with kind of the finishing spices. This is kind of our go-to breakfast. This is what we do down at the farmer's market. We have kind of a pop-up restaurant down there that we serve eggs to order, peppers, onions, mushrooms, and then this house-cured bacon. And we rotate to sausage as well. And so these are, the basic facets. Ketogenic meal. I think the people that eat this way really are supportive of it. There's not a lot of other. I think why they took us in was because there wasn't any other low-carb options down there. And I think what's really important is that this can be done anywhere, particularly at home. I mean, it's really one pan. We've got, it's one cast iron pan. Any type of skillet will work. 6 ingredients. It's eggs, some sort of vegetable, and a meat. Preferably bacon, and fattier the better. And that's just about it. We're done, and it takes about 5 minutes. And this is just a pretty basic breakfast scramble that we do here. You can season it the way that you want to season it. You can do whatever that you want to do into your particular direction, but it's going to have the fat content that you need. And it's very heavy. I should also mention, just a little cook tip, cast iron is always better. Not only does it retain heat better, but it's going to have the seasoning, and it's just going to get better through time. And so, we've been using these for years, and this is like the flavor profile. We use all of our braising in Dutch ovens. We do everything because we utilize, and they just get better and better through time. So, and the next step, let's give it a shot here.
Yeah.
And taste. Make sure you get plenty of that bacon. That is the primary source of your fats.
Awesome.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Simple.
So good.